Story 1. We were slowly making our way along a narrow country road, leaving behind small towns and villages. There were about 20 people in the bus cabin, tourists, full of expectations to see something truly special. As for me, as a blogger, I often travel to such places where few dare to venture. Last week, while looking for my next destination, I stumbled upon an advertisement on one of the websites. It talked about a tour to an ancient city hidden deep in the country among rocky mountains. The photos of these places looked so mesmerizing that I couldn't resist and booked a ticket, which, to my surprise, turned out to be quite affordable. Departure from my city required 2 days of travel, so we spent the first night in a hotel. I kept detailed notes for my blog throughout the journey. Along the way, I managed to get acquainted with several fellow travelers. Among them were Frank and Sarah, a lovely elderly couple with whom it was pleasant to converse, unlike my seat neighbor. He was reserved and taciturn. Even attempting to start a conversation seemed like a risky endeavor. Later, I learned his name, Victor. He was dressed entirely in black trousers, t-shirt, vest, and a hat on his head. And although his appearance could fit the description of a goth, he apparently just preferred the color black. On the second day of our journey, we continued our path through fields and forests. I occasionally made notes while a joyful and lively atmosphere prevailed in the bus. We were eagerly anticipating the moment when we would finally reach our destination. But suddenly, the bus stopped. Puzzled, we looked out the windows, but all we saw was the surrounding forest. "Hey, what's going on? Where have you brought us?" The excitement grew among the passengers. Our conductor, a middle-aged woman, calmly reassured us, explaining that the city was located amidst mountains and there was no road leading directly to it. We would have to walk the upcoming stretch of the journey through picturesque trails. She also assured us of our safety. As soon as we left the bus, we were greeted by 2 people, a man and a woman, both around 40 years old, dressed as if straight out of the 19th century history books. He in an elegant long coat with an impressive collar and a top hat, emphasizing his status, and she in an exquisite dress with a refined corset and a voluminous skirt adorned with bead and ribbon patterns. Introducing themselves as Archibald and Mary Ann, their names sounded as authentic as their appearance, and I gazed at them in awe. Had they just returned from a costume party? After gathering our belongings, our newfound guides invited us to follow them. Seizing the moment, I turned on the camera and began documenting our journey, commenting on each stage. The route turned out to be quite rich and took quite some time. Initially, our path led through dense forest, where old trees formed a canopy over our heads. The wide trail wound among the trees, and we tried not to lag behind each other to avoid getting lost. Emerging from the forest thicket, we came to a spacious clearing where we were greeted by warm sunlight and a gentle breeze, filling the air with the scent of wildflowers and grass. We took a short break to enjoy the surrounding beauty. Next, our path led us to swamps, where the ground became less stable and the paths became more treacherous. But even here, amidst the watery expanse and the greenery of the marsh grass, there was its own charm. Soon our path again delved into the forest, where a noticeable ascent began towards the mountain. The breath of my companions quickened, and they began to slow down, trying to cope with fatigue. Unlike them, thanks to my experience and professional training, I easily overcame these obstacles. As we progressed along the trail, the surrounding atmosphere became increasingly gloomy, casting a shadow on the group's mood. Conversations died down, and everyone walked, lost in their thoughts, awaiting the end of the journey. But suddenly, our silence was shattered by admiring and astonished exclamations. From behind the last bend of the trail, before us appeared a sight deserving of all praise. Against the backdrop of high mountain peaks, like an impregnable fortress of time, rose a Gothic city. Its ancient features stood out against the natural landscape, creating the sensation that time had frozen here. I stood still, stunned by this beauty. Our 2-hour hike to this place was not in vain. Our enthusiasm was interrupted by the guides, reminding us of the need to continue our journey. Soon we found ourselves on a dirt road passing by fields golden with corn and various vegetables, as well as past farms where animals grazed. I continued filming, noticing people working in the fields. Their clothing was simple and reminiscent of an ancient cut. This detail made me wonder if this city was inhabited by the Amish. Well, it's quite possible, I thought. Passing by, I noticed that the workers looked up and watched us with a grim and doomed expression on their faces. No one else in the group, engrossed in cheerful conversations and discussions of what we had just seen, noticed this, except for Victor, who, as before, walked silently, standing out in his solitude among the bustling crowd. After the fields and farms were left behind, our path led to large wooden gates which were wide open at that moment. We crossed them, and before us appeared a view that seemed to transport us back to the Gothic and medieval era. Cobbled streets wound among ancient stone buildings with sharp architectural forms typical of the Gothic style. Tall windows with pointed tops, decorated with stained glass, let soft light into the rooms. People in simple attire of ancient style bustled about the streets. They went about their daily business, exchanging news or hurrying on personal errands, occasionally pausing to exchange a few words with acquaintances. Our arrival did not go unnoticed by the local residents. Casting a quick glance at us, they continued their daily activities without further ado. It seemed they didn't want to engage with us. Following our guides, we headed to an ancient establishment that in past times would have been called a tavern. Opening the door, we entered a room filled with wooden tables and a bar counter, behind which stood a bartender busy cleaning mugs. Some patrons glanced at us, meeting our gazes before returning to their conversations. All of this created the feeling of immersing into a historical film or game dedicated to the Middle Ages. The impression was truly stunning. Marianne, our guide, suggested we take seats and approach the bartender to place an order. We settled in comfortably, admiring the antique interior. About 10 minutes later, our food was served. It was a simple porridge with meat and mushrooms, accompanied by a drink resembling compote. Some in the group, feeling dissatisfied, declined the food, but I decided to try it, and it turned out to be quite good. After we finished our meal, we left the tavern and continued our tour of the city. Our footsteps echoed through the cobblestone streets, leading through the labyrinth of ancient buildings. The air was filled with the scents of local shops selling fresh vegetables, herbs, and homemade goods. Curved metal signs depicting symbols of craftsmen and merchants creaked in the wind, inviting to peek inside workshops and shops. We passed by stone houses with high-pointed roofs adorned with elegant stained glass, which caught and refracted the sunlight. Children dressed in clothes that in the modern world could only be seen at a historical reenactment or in a museum played on the narrow streets. Their laughter and shouts filled the air, making the past palpable. The journey through the city culminated at its very heart, the central square, where a huge castle towered. Its massive walls and towers dominated the cityscape. The castle was surrounded by a wide terrace with stone balustrades, from which there was a breathtaking view of the entire city and the surrounding mountains. As we passed by the majestic castle and absorbed the beauty of its architecture, my gaze unexpectedly rose to the balcony. There, standing as if immune to time and reality, was a girl of unparalleled beauty. Her hair, black as a moonless night, cascaded down her shoulders, and she wore an elaborate black dress adorned with intricate lace. She surveyed the surroundings with a melancholic gaze, and it seemed as if some goddess looked upon the mortal world from above. This scene deeply impressed me, leaving an indelible mark on my memory. Next to the palace rose a huge cathedral with magnificent stained glass windows, which we also explored, taking photographs. I continued filming for my blog, striving to capture every moment of this unique journey. Soon we left the square and headed towards the outskirts of the city, returning to the same tavern where we had stopped earlier. Looking around, I suddenly realized that Victor had disappeared. Mentioning this to the others, I understood that no one had noticed the moment of his departure. Everyone began to worry about him, but our guides assured us that they would take the investigation upon themselves and urged us not to worry. They invited us into the tavern, where we entered just as dusk was beginning to fall. The room turned out to be empty, which seemed strange. Suddenly a loud bell rang out, echoing throughout the city. Puzzled, we began to look around for explanations, but Archibald reassured us, stating that it was a common occurrence every evening, and promised that our food would be served soon. With these words, he and Marianne left the tavern. Where they were going was unknown to us. Their departure seemed suspicious to me, and I decided to follow them out onto the street. There, I witnessed a multitude of people rushing towards the city center. I approached one of the passers-by in astonishment and asked where all these people were going. The man, startled by my question, cast a glance filled with alarm at me and quickened his pace without answering. His reaction only fueled my curiosity. Returning to the tavern, I met Frank and Sarah, who asked me with bewilderment about what was happening. I confess that I myself did not fully understand the situation. While people continued to swiftly pass us by, their cautious and seemingly sympathetic glances left behind a feeling of unease. Upon returning to the tavern, I discovered that the food still had not been served. It seemed we had simply been forgotten. The situation became increasingly mysterious. The kitchen was empty, as were the other rooms we checked in search of anyone. Stepping outside, we were surprised to find that the street was also deserted. Approaching a neighboring house, I confirmed that the door was locked. The same scene played out with other houses. They were all closed. Confusion and anxiety gripped us even more. We gathered together to discuss our next strategy. Various suggestions were made among us. Some insisted on searching for the local residents, while others preferred to stay safe in the tavern. Night was falling, and I had a strong sense that we needed to find shelter. While we were having these discussions, night fell imperceptibly. The city's streetlights remained off, and the darkness engulfed the windows of the houses. The darkness was only dispelled by the full moon, whose silvery light illuminated everything around. Suddenly, our conversation was interrupted by a strange noise, resembling the rustle of wings, accompanied by uncomfortable squeaking or screeching. We looked around bewildered, trying to determine the source of the sound. Then Frank pointed upwards, and as we raised our heads, we noticed approaching dots in the sky. At first glance, they appeared to be bats, their silhouettes drawn against the moonlight. This sight left us frozen in amazement. But as the figures drew closer, it became evident that they were not just bats. My thoughts were jumbled. Is this some kind of performance? But they were getting closer, and I could see them better. They were monsters resembling humans, with no clothing and leathery wings sprouting from their backs. I couldn't see their faces as it was dark. They looked dangerous and frightening, and I realized we needed to find shelter. "Run to the tavern!" I yelled, trying to spur everyone into action. The ensuing panic caused us to jostle and hurry, each striving to take cover inside. In the chaos, someone fell, others screamed in fear, but eventually, we managed to burst into the tavern and slam the door behind us. Deep darkness filled the tavern. I realized that there was apparently no electricity in this city, and no one had bothered with candles. When the last of us rushed inside, I bolted the door. People hid wherever they could. I sat next to Frank and Sarah, waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone wore frightened and concerned faces. What were those creatures? Gargoyles? Vampires? Maybe it's some kind of show for guests, I thought. But the creatures seemed too real and terrifying to believe such a thing. I peeked out from my hiding spot, trying to make out the silhouettes outside the window. The windows were small, and one of our companions, a young man in his mid-20s, decided to approach one of them to see what was happening. Others shouted at him, "Come back, what are you doing?" But he bravely approached and looked out the window. Suddenly, the face of one of the creatures appeared in the window. The guy screamed and jumped back, after which a series of events followed. The door flew off its hinges with force, and 3 of these creatures burst into the room. They surveyed the room with a terrifying grin. Finally, I could see their faces. They were the most horrifying things I had ever seen in my life. Their faces resembled something between bats and monkeys. They were very repulsive and frightening. We froze in shock, not daring to move, as each of the creatures instantly leapt into action with such speed that my eyes couldn't catch their movements. They targeted 3 nearest victims, seizing them by the throat and plunging their long fangs into their necks. "They are vampires after all," echoed in my head as I experienced wild terror. A horrifying scream rang out, causing my heart to nearly stop. It was one of the victims, apparently feeling excruciating pain. The other victims also screamed horribly. This scene literally paralyzed us, and before our eyes the vampires drained the blood of the 3 people, who literally turned into mummies in a matter of seconds. When they finished their business and discarded the bodies, they looked at us and started moving in our direction. Panic ensued. Everyone started running and scattering in different directions, but these creatures were too fast, not allowing anyone to escape. To my surprise, they didn't kill anyone. They simply grabbed people by the hands and then let go. I couldn't see what they were doing. I just ran, heading towards the kitchen, trying to hide there. Feeling like one of these creatures was chasing me, at the last moment I was grabbed from behind and thrown backward. Falling on my back, I saw the face of this creature, which was very close to me. It emitted a foul odor, and steam came out of its flat nostrils. It grabbed me by the wrist joint. I felt a sharp, burning pain, but I didn't lose consciousness. After that, the creature released me, and I fell to the floor. Lying on the floor, I raised my hand and looked at it. There was a mark, a tattoo in the form of a rose. It was beautiful, yet frightening. My hand still stung, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. Looking around, I noticed that these creatures had caught almost everyone present. Eventually, they grabbed 3 people, but unlike the others, they didn't let them go. People struggled, trying to break free, but it was futile. Impossible to resist such superhuman strength. Dragging these unfortunate souls behind them, the creatures rushed out of the tavern. I ran after them onto the street and saw them flying towards the city center, carrying people who struggled in the air. The sight was truly terrifying. The creatures themselves flew unevenly, sometimes soaring upwards, sometimes descending downwards like bats. Gradually, other survivors began to appear on the street. Some were crying, some were in shock, and some simply trembled, staring blankly at the ground. This was not a performance. We were truly in the midst of a nightmare, Of the 20 people in our group, 7 were missing. A decision needed to be made about our next actions. Frank, who had been bowed down with grief, came up to me and asked what we were going to do next. I didn't know whether we should stay or leave. Then I noticed that several people were heading towards the gate, apparently wanting to leave this place. The rest of us followed suit. Although it was dark, we tried to move as quickly as possible. Soon we reached the gate, which turned out to be locked. We started examining the opening mechanism and soon found a lever near the gate. Pulling it, we heard the sounds of gears and mechanisms, and to our surprise, the gate swung open by itself. Without hesitation, we rushed outside. Soon, in the darkness under the moonlight, the outlines of the fields and farms we already knew began to emerge. We looked around, fearing an attack from the darkness. After a while, the road ended, and the path we had come by began. Suddenly, a man in his 40s who was walking ahead screamed and grabbed his hand. We ran up to him, trying to understand what had happened. As I approached him, I felt such a strong, burning sensation in my hand that it was unbearable. Looking at my hand, I saw the mark left by those creatures, which began to glow red. I took a step back and returned to the road, where the burning gradually subsided. I thought that these creatures had marked us so that we couldn't leave. This thought filled me with horror. One of the men who had previously sat with a vacant gaze began to panic and choke. We tried to calm him down, but it didn't help. He started shouting, "I can't! This must be a dream! I just need to wake up! Maybe if I run fast!" We tried to stop him, but he broke free and ran towards the path. Despite the visible pain from the burning, he kept running until he burst into flames and burned before our eyes, turning into ashes. In shock, we watched this scene, realizing that we were doomed to stay here. No one wanted to move any further. We just sat on the edge of the road, waiting for our fate. Until dawn broke. When morning came, each of us tried to warm up and collect our thoughts. We had just over half of the original number of people left. Many had died or disappeared. What happened to those taken by those creatures was too terrifying to even imagine. My camera was smashed, but that wasn't the worst of it. The question was pressing. Could we escape from here? Suddenly, in the morning mist, we saw a couple of people walking along the road, a young woman and an old man. We all stood up and tensed, waiting to see what would happen when they approached, and if we would get any answers from them. As they approached, we saw that the woman was dressed in modern clothes, while the man wore ancient attire. They approached us slowly, afraid of scaring us away. The woman spoke first. "Excuse me, are you okay? I know you're scared right now, but I'll try to explain what's going on." But none of us responded. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Emily, and the man next to me is Rob. Like you, I ended up here and managed to survive. This city was initially conceived as a trap for people. In fact, even if you didn't have the marks, you still wouldn't be able to escape from here alive. Because the surrounding areas are patrolled by servants. Her words were interrupted by a burly man named John, who asked in a rough voice what these creatures were and what this place was. Emily replied, "As I've already told you, this place is a trap. Those creatures you saw yesterday, we call them gargoyles. But in reality, they're vampires. Yes, vampires exist. This is not a dream or fiction. They have been living in the city for centuries, luring their victims here and feeding on them. This place is like a farm for them. Imagine you keep livestock nearby, tied up on a chain. The people living here are akin to them." We all stood in shock, digesting this news as if it were ripped from some fantastical novel. Then I asked a question. If you knew we would be attacked, why didn't you warn us? And where were all those people rushing to last night?" Emily didn't immediately respond, apparently trying to formulate her answer. "You see, I'm very sorry that so many people died, but I couldn't warn you because it means I would die myself. Every last Sunday of the month, the harvest takes place. Those creatures come out and begin to hunt. We all hide in the church on that day, which you might have seen in the city center. It's the only chance to survive, as they can't reach there. Why didn't I warn you? It's because of your escorts. They're not human. I don't know what those creatures are, but they don't age or change. The oldest residents of this city say they've been the same since before. The problem is they can move during the day, unlike those creatures that only appear at night. They're incredibly strong and invulnerable. I've heard that many have tried to fight them, but they always lose. I would say they're some sort of overseers. If you don't obey the rules, they'll detain you and prevent you from entering the church. Then you'll become food for the vampires. That's why nobody messes with them, and I advise you not to get too close to them either." With these words, I asked another question. "What if it turns out that you can't bring in new victims to the city? What will happen then?" She replied, "Then they'll search for victims among the townsfolk. This couple will choose them, so they're feared just like the gargoyles." Then I remembered that man I asked where everyone was headed, who didn't answer me but ran away frightened. Apparently, if we didn't become food, they would. So they don't interfere. It was beneficial for them to have more people coming here as it affects their safety. Emily continued, "In fact, it's a friendly community here and people are united, although they don't help potential victims. But if you get the mark, you become part of the city. So let's help you settle in here and find you a job." Then a man named John couldn't hold back and shouted, "What the hell? Are you saying we're going to stay here to live? Haven't you tried to fight these creatures? How could you agree to just be food?" Emily replied, "Of course, nobody wants to become a victim, but that doesn't mean we should give up. Believe me, the people living here try to fight to find a way, but for now, they can't do anything. So maybe one of you will find a way out of this situation. In the meantime, we have to keep living to find a chance to defeat them." Then I asked, "What percentage of the locals are newcomers? And who are the natives?" Rob, who came with her, answered, "In general, 70% of the local residents are natives. The rest are newcomers." John said with anger, "So people have been living here for centuries but can't find a way out. How many generations have passed and you claim we can fight?" Emily replied, "We have no other choice. So you can do whatever you want. The rest of you can come with me. I'll help you settle in." No one objected, not even John, and everyone silently followed Emily. First, we went to the farm where they asked us who knew how to work on a farm. 5 people, including Frank and Sarah, answered affirmatively. They decided to stay there and work. The rest of us continued our journey into the city, where each of us was given a job and a place to stay. I was appointed as Rob's assistant, who took me to his home. It was not far from the main gate where we came from. We walked along the street filled with local residents who looked at us with surprise. It wouldn't be fair to say they were happy, but there was a certain sympathy in their eyes. As we passed by, they all greeted Rob, asked how he was, or asked him to come in and help with something. Soon we turned into a small alley, and after walking along it for a bit, stopped at the door of a small but neat and well-kept house. Rob inserted the key, opened the door, and invited me inside. Then he showed me around the house. It was a modest dwelling without any particular elegance, but with all the necessary amenities. There was a small kitchen and a living room. The bedrooms were upstairs. Rob led me there and opened one of the rooms. When I entered, I saw a bed and a small bedside table. As I understood, Rob lived alone in this house. Now I became his new neighbor. When I unpacked my things, Rob said to me, "Make yourself at home. On the first day, we don't let newcomers work. We give them a rest and time to gather their thoughts. Ahead of you lies a tough life, friend, but the main thing is not to give up. Tomorrow morning, I'll wake you up and we'll start working. And for now, you can do whatever you want, for example. Go explore the city." That's what I would do. I thanked him, after which he left, and I lay down on the bed, remembering the events of the past day. It was truly a nightmarish experience. I remembered the screams we heard when those people were killed, their faces, the faces of those creatures. It all felt like a nightmare. I needed to gather my thoughts and figure out how to escape from here. But soon, sleep overtook me, most likely because I hadn't slept all night. In the morning, I was woken up by Rob. It turned out that I had slept for almost a day, which had never happened to me before. Getting up, I felt a bit groggy, but at the same time refreshed. I went downstairs and washed up in the makeshift sink, after which Rob prepared breakfast and we ate together. After finishing, Rob grabbed a bag of tools and we headed outside. I asked him what we would be doing, to which he replied, "My job is to fix broken things, so I'm like a handyman who does whatever needs to be done. For example, if someone needs a door or a cupboard fixed, or if someone has plumbing issues, they usually call me." Then I asked about money, or how we would be paid here. He replied, "There are about 3,000 people living here, but we don't use money. As you can see, it's hard to produce things here as the area is limited by the city, which is located in the mountains, and the nearby territories used as fields. So there's not much room to expand here, and we try to conserve all production items. We have a strong community here, so everyone tries to do their job. The products from the fields are brought to a warehouse, where they are distributed, and everyone can come and take what they need. Of course, everyone should take only as much as they can eat, and no more. We have an elder and his assistants who oversee order, who takes what and who does what. Perhaps you'll meet them in the future." I nodded, acquainting myself with this new reality. After walking 2 streets, we arrived at a small house with a neat courtyard where a couple of chickens were grazing. Rob approached the porch and knocked on the door. A minute later, an old woman opened it, who was glad to see us and said she had been waiting for us for a long time to fix her old chest of drawers. We entered the house, which was very cozy, and headed to the bedroom. The problem was with the hinge of the door, from which one of the nails had come off. Rob took out his tools and started repairing. Meanwhile, I looked around and found an interesting wooden plaque in the chest of drawers, on which there was a strange symbol. A circle with a triangle in the center, inside of which was a cube. This symbol caught my attention, and I asked the old woman about its meaning. She replied that she didn't know, as the plaque had been passed down to her. Surprised by this information, I asked her how long she had been living here. She said she had lived here all her life, just like her ancestors, which meant she was a native resident. This symbol seemed like a clue to me. I asked Rob what he thought about it, but he evaded the answer, saying he would tell me about it later. After fixing the door, Rob asked if the old woman needed any more help, but she replied that everything was fine, and she didn't want to bother us anymore. After thanking us, we left and headed towards the city center. I saw the magnificent palace again, on the balcony of which stood the same girl in black. Asking Rob who she was, I got the answer that he didn't know, but she was definitely some kind of evil. It turned out that those gargoyles lived inside it, therefore she might be associated with them. I continued to stare at her as if enchanted, though it was hard to see her from a distance. I understood that she was very beautiful. Rob woke me from my contemplation, placing his hand on my shoulder. I startled, as if waking up from a dream, and we continued our way. So 3 weeks passed. I helped Rob and gradually settled into the life of this city. In general, everything was calm except for that nightmarish dream. Otherwise, it might have seemed like an ordinary town with friendly inhabitants. Although everyone here walked around and seemed cheerful, there was still a feeling that dark clouds hung over the people. We continued to work day by day. I met different people, and on weekends I visited Frank and Sarah, who even enjoyed being on the farm. Time flew by quickly. Sometimes I remembered my bus neighbor, Victor. Where could he have disappeared to? One day, as I was walking with Rob, that same couple, Mariana and Archibald, approached us. My colleague noticeably paled. I too became wary, but these two just smiled their smiles, which after I learned who they were, seemed creepy. They asked me if I had seen Victor, but I answered negatively, after which they said I should warn them if I encounter him. If you try to hide him, there will be consequences, they added, and without saying goodbye, left. I glanced at Rob, who was sweating profusely, wiping his forehead, clearly nervous. And when they left, he breathed a sigh of relief. As I understood, this couple were indeed dreadful beings. The next harvest was just a couple of days away. We responded to a call at an old carpentry workshop. A man named Jacob worked there. Rob knocked on the door, and we entered, finding ourselves in a spacious, naturally lit workshop. The air was filled with the smell of wood and varnish. There was an amazing order around. Tools neatly hung on the walls, and jars of paints and oils lined the shelves. In the center of the room stood a large carpentry workbench, strewn with various tools and blanks. Jacob greeted us with a warm smile, inviting us further inside. He led us to the lathe, which stood by the window. Soon we realized that one of the mechanisms was worn out and needed replacement. Around the lathe were scattered blanks, which we began to move to free up more space. Suddenly, I slipped on a lying log and started to fall forward. I would have hit the wall, but instinctively I thrust my elbows forward to protect myself. But then my elbows punched a hole in the wall. It seemed like the wall was made of thin wood. My companions rushed to me, asking if I was okay. I apologized for damaging the wall and said not to worry about me. Meanwhile, Rob approached the hole in the wall, his face changing. He muttered to himself, "Is this a miracle, or is it fate?" I didn't understand what he meant and approached closer to examine the hole. Meanwhile, my colleague began to tear off more pieces of the wall. "Hey, what are you doing, buddy?" I said. But he didn't answer, just continued dismantling the wall until a large stone plaque with the familiar symbol appeared before us. A triangle with a cube in the middle. I looked at Rob, whose hands were trembling, and who couldn't take his eyes off the symbol. Then he turned and said, "Sorry, Jacob, but we'll be back next time. For now, hide this symbol with something." Then he told me to follow him. We went out onto the street and headed southwest of the town, where I had never been before. Rob hurriedly crossed one street after another, and I tried not to lag behind. Soon we found ourselves in front of a large building, went inside, and went up to the 3rd floor. Rob knocked on the door and we heard a voice telling us to come in. My neighbor hurriedly entered with the words, "Edmund, I finally found him." When I entered the office, I saw an old man with a long beard sitting at the table, holding a sheet of paper. He looked up and asked, "What did you find?" "The third sign. It was in Jacob's carpentry workshop," Rob replied. The old man, apparently named Edmund, jumped up and said excitedly, "Has it finally happened?" Then he went to the wall, pressed a button, and a secret door opened. Opening it wider, he stepped inside. Rob followed him and gestured for me to come. When I found myself inside, I saw a room filled with sheets glued with names, maps, and the same symbol. Rob and Edmund stood near a large map of the city hanging in the center of the room. They marked a point that apparently was the carpentry workshop, after which they drew a straight line from another point at the top of the map. From this point, another line led down to the left, forming a kind of triangle. They looked at it with undisguised excitement and then, using a ruler, also drew perpendiculars from the points to each side of the triangle. As a result, there was an intersection. They highlighted this place, and Edmund said, "This is an old fountain. Here it is, that place." Then they looked at each other hopefully. Suddenly, Edmund turned his gaze to me and asked, "And who is this?" "This is my colleague and neighbor, Mike," Rob said. "I see." He shook my hand and said, "I'm the elder of this town. My name is Edmund. Nice to meet you." I shook his hand and asked what was going on. After that, Rob began to explain. "Remember, you found a plaque with a mysterious sign at that old lady's house? I promised to tell you about it later. So, this is the secret we recently discovered. We found 2 more identical symbols in other parts of the city, and realized we needed to find the third one. At the intersection of their perpendiculars, we will find a place related to our marks. That is, perhaps there we will learn the solution and be able to escape from here." I was shocked and delighted by this news, as it was a chance. I said that we needed to go and explore this place immediately, but they both shook their heads and said that there were many spies here, and we needed to wait out the harvest, which would be in a few days. I also remembered this terrifying event. Understood. After which, we discussed the details and decided to delve into the mystery later. It was Sunday. Rob had left somewhere in the morning and hadn't returned yet. I was noticeably nervous, as it was the first time I experienced Harvest Day without being a victim. I knew that when the bell rang, I had to go to the cathedral, which was located in the city center. With nothing much to do, I wandered around the city, observing what people were up to. There was tension in the air. After strolling around, I returned home, had lunch, and then headed to the city center, walking around the square, admiring the sights. I saw that girl again on the balcony, looking melancholic as ever. Suddenly, she turned her head and our eyes met. I don't know why, but shivers ran down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back. She noticed this but didn't react, turning her head again and gazing into the distance. I decided to leave quickly and headed towards the cathedral. I walked around it feeling quite nervous. Why did I come here so early? Because I was afraid of being late. As it started to get dark, a loud bell rang near the cathedral, almost deafening me. I noticed people gathering around the church. Among them, I saw familiar faces of those who had come with me. However, I didn't see Sarah and Frank anywhere. Rob was also missing. I thought there was still time, and they would make it. Deciding to go inside, I found a huge cathedral capable of accommodating several thousand people. Inside, it was dimly lit, with only candles and lamps faintly illuminating the space, creating a mysterious atmosphere. Stained glass windows depicted scenes from sacred texts, playing with colors on the walls and floor. Rows of benches were filled with people praying or just sitting and waiting. The silence in the cathedral was only broken by the whisper of prayers and soft chanting coming from behind the altar. I was noticeably agitated. Rob was still nowhere to be found, and my elderly friends were also missing. I headed towards the entrance and noticed that fewer people were entering. It was getting dark outside, and the guards at the entrance were about to close the doors. I rushed to them and asked, "Wait, there are still people who haven't come." They shook their heads and said that it was time to close. I panicked for my friends, looking around for help. Then I noticed Emily, the same girl I met on the first day. I ran up to her and told her that Rob and my friends were missing. She sadly lowered her head and said, "There were no newcomers this month, so the victims were chosen from the townspeople." Her words shocked me. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her, and shouted, "Why aren't you doing anything? Why didn't you tell me earlier?" She remained silent. How did it come to be that the people closest to me became victims? Their faces flashed through my mind, especially Rob's. I had grown attached to that old man, and a determination rose within me. I asked Emily where they were. She replied that the victims were usually tied up near the old gates. "So I think they're there." "The old gates?" I asked. "Is that where we came from the first time?" She nodded affirmatively. I turned and ran. The guards were already closing the doors, but I pushed them aside and rushed outside. I ran with all my might and soon reached the right place. In the distance, I saw silhouettes of people standing near a stone pedestal with iron rings used to tie the victims. They were my friends. Gasping for breath, I ran up to them. Their doomed faces turned into surprise. Rob shouted, "What are you doing, you fool? Run from here, they'll be here soon." But I shook my head and started looking for a way to free them. They were chained to a thick chain. Damn it, I should have brought tools with me. Tugging at the chain, to my horror, I heard a familiar rustle of wings, that unpleasant screech. I turned my head and saw those creatures flying in the sky. I swallowed hard and continued to pull at the chain. Carefully examining it, I noticed that it was securely fastened, meaning there must be a mechanism to open it. I began to circle the pedestal in search of it, occasionally glancing at the sky. Those creatures were getting closer. Circling the pedestal, I saw a lever at the back. They certainly loved making mechanisms in this city. I pulled it with all my strength, but it didn't give in. Suddenly, I heard noise nearby. Looking out from behind the pedestal, I saw that the creatures had already arrived. They landed with a crash and began to look around, clearly in no hurry, enjoying the moment. Meanwhile, I was trying to pull that damn lever, which stubbornly refused to move. Then one of the creatures grabbed an unfamiliar woman and forcefully tore the chain. I couldn't just stand by and watch. I dashed out from behind the pedestal, shouting, trying to distract it. The creature turned its attention to me, dropping the woman. I turned and started running. All three creatures took to the air and chased after me. I ran for my life, afraid to look back, but I could feel them catching up with me. Suddenly, I tripped and fell, tumbling over. Landing on my back, I opened my eyes and saw those creatures leaning over me, their hideous grins sending shivers down my spine. Then I thought that it was the end for me. One of the creatures reached out to me. I closed my eyes, preparing for death, but then I heard gunshots. Opening my eyes, I saw that one of the creature's heads had exploded and another's hand was blown off. The third one managed to take off into the distance. It was my chance. Jumping up, I looked around and saw a silhouette emerging from the darkness. Trying to make out who it was, I soon recognized him. It was Victor. He was quickly approaching me and said that we needed to hurry. I looked up at the sky and saw the third creature flying off into the distance. I had a million questions for him, but Victor dragged me towards the pedestal. The captives, shocked, looked at us. Our savior circled the pedestal and shouted for me to help him. Together we pulled the lever, which was very difficult, but soon we heard the sound of a mechanism. Returning to our friends, I saw that the rings had slid forward and the chains could be freed. However, they were still hanging on the people. Victor said we needed to run quickly, as that creature would likely call for reinforcements. He asked if there was a place where we could take cover. We started to think, and then Rob said that there might be one place and set off. We followed. After about 10 minutes of our journey, we reached the fountain. Victor, with doubt in his voice, addressed Rob, "Where do you plan to take shelter here?" To which Rob did not respond, but began to circumnavigate the fountain, feeling every corner of it. The fountain was turned off, and Rob, not losing hope, pulled on everything that could move in search of a hidden mechanism. Suddenly he cried out, "Help me! There must be some mechanism here." We joined in his search, although it was not clear what exactly we were looking for. From time to time, I glanced at the sky, expecting the appearance of gargoyles. We continued our futile attempts to find something when suddenly a screech sounded from the sky, causing all of us to startle. Rob commanded us to accelerate our search. Continuing to feel every inch of the fountain in the darkness, I finally found a button under the platform. Pressing it, I heard the sound of a mechanism activating. Stepping back, I saw a staircase open at the bottom of the fountain before me. We exchanged surprised glances, then Rob began to descend first. We followed him, still hearing the distant screeches of the vampires. Victor turned on a flashlight, illuminating our path along the spiral staircase leading us deeper underground. Eventually, we emerged onto a platform where we found another button. Pressing it, we heard the familiar sound of mechanisms, and the staircase returned to its original position, sealing the entrance behind us. We continued moving through the long tunnel, adorned with intricate carvings, anticipating danger from every side. After some time, we reached a cavernous chamber supported by huge pillars. In the center of this hall, we found a skeleton, next to which lay a diary. Approaching closer, we wrested the diary from the cold skeletal fingers and began to read. It turned out that the diary belonged to one of the pioneers of this city, who claimed to know how to lift the curse hanging over the city. Unfortunately, he was wounded in an attempt to free the city and bequeathed in the diary to continue his work to whoever found his message. The diary indicated to continue down the corridor, where we needed to destroy a specific cube guarded by sentries. After reading, we exchanged glances, deciding on our next steps. Victor suggested continuing the journey alone, but Rob and I insisted on going together with him. Not wanting to argue, Victor agreed. Leaving the others in the relative safety of the chamber, we set off down the corridor, going deeper. Drawings began to appear on the walls depicting vampires and humans. One of them showed a woman on a throne, surrounded by winged creatures, with people in cages around her depicted with such despair that even through the primitive outlines of the drawing, it was evident. Curiosity gripped me. Then the image of the beauty on the balcony of the palace flashed in my memory. Could it be her? Could she be the head vampire, or, as it is correctly called, an elder? As we continued our journey, I decided to ask Victor questions: who he was and how he managed to defeat these creatures. Victor hesitated for a moment, as if considering his answer or deciding whether to respond to me. Finally, he said, "You could call me a vampire hunter. I killed these creatures with silver bullets. Yes, it sounds like a cliché, but it didn't appear for no reason." After these words, he fell silent, but my curiosity was not quenched. "Still, tell me, where did you come from and how did you learn about this city?" I continued to insist. Victor replied, "I've been hunting these creatures for a long time. It's, so to speak, a family business. How did I find this city? I always follow people's disappearances, and this area seemed suspicious to me. So I started searching. And here I am. Now my task is to destroy them, and above all, to save people." After these words, I couldn't get anything else out of him. We continued in silence. Only the chain hanging on Rob rang along the way. Suddenly, our path was blocked by a dead end, in the wall of which a small opening was found, located at floor level. Through it one could crawl, lying on the ground, and the flickering red light from it foretold of something unusual beyond this passage. Victor was the first to lie down on the ground and begin to squeeze through this narrow opening. I followed suit. When I finally emerged on the other side, before me stood a magnificent hall, filled with red light emanating from stones set around its perimeter. This hall was something like an ancient temple, where every detail seemed imbued with magic and history. In the center of this majestic space, like the heart of the temple, a transparent cube floated in the air. Within its depths beat a living heart, pulsating and emitting light, coloring the walls of the hall in heavy shades of red. This sight was simultaneously breathtaking and slightly frightening, as the heart inside the cube seemed to be something alive, whose fate was closely intertwined with the secrets of this place. Approaching the cube, we were as if hypnotized by this majestic spectacle. Suddenly, Victor, taking a pistol in his hands and aiming at the heart inside the cube, declared that it needed to be destroyed. However, in the next moment he sharply turned around, pushed us aside, and himself recoiled backward. Through the air, a huge creature soared, and looking back, I saw on the ground a creature that had landed resembling a wolf. Werewolf flashed through my mind, or at least someone very much like him. The creature emitted a terrible growl. With a battle cry, Victor rushed forward. "This is the guardian of this place. It must be killed." From his holster, he pulled out a second pistol and threw it to me. Struggling to catch the weapon, I aimed it at the creature. I didn't know how to use it and hesitated until Rob guided me on how to remove the safety. Before I could do it, Victor opened fire. The creature tried to dodge, but several bullets still hit their marks. However, it didn't give up, and making a powerful leap, lunged at Victor, opening its jaws. He skillfully dodged the attack, continuing to shoot. The creature attacked again, but Victor didn't stop firing. Finally, the creature managed to knock him to the ground. Victor grabbed it by the ears, trying to prevent it from biting him. As I tried not to hit Victor, I eventually found confidence and began to shoot, emptying the magazine. The creature fell lifeless. Victor pushed it away from himself, approached me, and with reproach in his eyes said, "You hesitated for too long." Then he headed towards the cube and, without hesitation, emptied the entire magazine into its heart. The heart momentarily froze and then began to bleed, flooding the floor with blood. Soon it stopped beating, and then from somewhere above, a piercing screech rang out, causing the ground beneath our feet to tremble. We understood that it was time to run. We quickly headed for the same opening through which we had entered this hall, hurrying to escape from the underground before new threats caught up with us. As we fled down the corridor, Rob noticed that the ominous mark still hadn't disappeared, to which Victor replied that destroying the heart was only the first step. Now it was time to face the Queen. "With whom?" I asked again, not believing my ears. "That woman in black who dwells in the palace," clarified Victor. Remembering her, I felt a mixture of admiration and horror. "Do we really have to kill such a beautiful creature?" flashed through my mind. But then I pushed that feeling aside, thinking that perhaps she had enchanted me. Returning to the hall, Victor announced that our next step was to penetrate the palace. However, there was one problem. The palace was teeming with servants, or rather gargoyles, and they needed to be distracted somehow. Then Rob proposed a plan. We needed to contact the elder in the cathedral to help us. They had a supply of fireworks hidden in a warehouse to the north of the city. "If we light them up, the gargoyles are sure to flock there," said Rob. After a short pause, Victor approved the plan, adding that it would be dangerous. Rob declared that he could handle it, but first he needed to get to the church, as the keys to the warehouse were with the elder. He volunteered to go there, taking the prisoners with him. After saying goodbye to Frank and Sarah, I wished them to take care of themselves. Then Victor and I climbed up the spiral staircase. Victor used a special spray that was supposed to hide us from the vampire's sense of smell and handed me a supply of bullets from his backpack, as well as several grenades, explaining how they worked. These grenades were equipped with special shards dangerous to vampires. Doing our best to stay in the shadows and not be noticed by the gargoyles, we headed towards the palace. After about an hour of waiting and hiding, I glanced at my watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Time was running out, as with the dawn, the gargoyles were supposed to return to the castle. Suddenly, explosions thundered in the distance and flashes of fireworks illuminated the sky to the north. The gargoyles reacted instantly and flew in that direction, many of them flying out of the castle. I mentally prayed for the guys to manage to get away from there. Taking advantage of the moment, we sneaked into the castle. To our surprise, the entrance door was open. Inside, we were greeted by a huge hall adorned with exquisite carvings and marble, with 2 staircases leading upstairs. Ascending to the second floor, we were met by 2 gargoyles swiftly rushing towards us. Victor, with unwavering calm, aimed and fired several shots, accurately hitting each one in the head, causing them to explode in flight. Amazed by his skill, I followed him until we reached the end of the huge hall, where 2 staircases branched off. Victor pointed me towards one of them and instructed me to ascend, warning me not to engage in a fight with the woman in black if I encountered her. Although I felt fear, I nodded in agreement and we parted ways. Ascending the staircase, I found myself in a hall with only 1 door. Carefully opening it, I saw inside the familiar pair of guides who had brought us to this city. They noticed me, smiled, and invited me in. Doubts battled in my mind, to flee or to confront them face to face. Deciding that I must help Victor, I entered the room, aiming my gun at them. Despite my aggression, they remained calm and Mariana offered to talk. However, I rejected her offer and fired a shot into her chest. She recoiled, then looked at the wound and glanced back at me, transforming into something horrifying, resembling a banshee. As she screamed and lunged at me, I began to shoot, noticing Archibald trying to flank me. Backing towards the door, I kept shooting until I found myself next to the exit. Then I quickly grabbed 2 grenades, tore off the pins with my teeth, and threw them at the enemy's feet. Jumping out of the room, I rolled along the hall at the moment of the explosion. Shielding my head from the shrapnel with my hands, I lay still until the dust settled. Standing up, I peeked into the room and saw that only charred remains were left of the guides. Overcoming a momentary feeling of nausea from the horrifying sight, I pulled myself together and returned to the staircase to find Victor and report what had happened. Soon I found myself facing a door again. Carefully opening it, my gaze fell upon a magnificent hall with a balcony in the center of which stood a throne. Gracefully seated upon it was the mysterious lady in black, whose beauty was so striking that it instantly captivated me. To my surprise, next to her, at her feet, sat Victor, his gaze absent as if he were under the spell of hypnosis. Realizing that I had been noticed, I dared to enter the hall. The vampire queen directed her piercing gaze at me, never once averting it. I advanced slowly, holding my weapon, ready for any outcome. She smiled at me, and I felt my hands starting to lower as if under the influence of her magnetism. Making a concerted effort of will, I shook myself to dispel the enchantment and stopped 10 paces away from her. Her smile didn't fade, and she remarked that she was impressed by our achievements. Despite the circumstances, her praise unexpectedly warmed my soul. The queen slowly rose from her throne, her gaze sweeping across the hall before returning to me. Suddenly, her face transformed, contorting into a terrifying grimace as she began to speak, raising her voice. "Immortality, darlings. It's not your dream, it's my reality. Time to me is but a pastime, your lives mere fleeting sparks. Power is my game, where I am the unquestionable victor. I am eternity, and you are transience. My world is one where I reign unyieldingly and undisputedly. Remember, every whisper, every sigh of yours is nothing but an echo of my greatness." Shocked by the abrupt change in mood in her words, I felt the tension in the air reach its peak. When she took a sudden step forward, I instinctively opened fire. To my horror, the bullets missed her, as if she gracefully dodged each one. In the next moment, I found myself losing control of my body. An invisible force lifted me into the air and began to twist my joints in unnatural directions, causing unbearable pain. A scream tore from my throat, and in the queen's eyes, I saw reflected pleasure in my suffering. It seemed like the end, but at the last moment, Victor came to the rescue, apparently breaking free from the queen's hypnotic influence. I noticed him unbuttoning his jacket, under which lay a vest filled with silver dynamite. My heart sank at the realization of his intentions. I wanted to scream to urge him to stop, but all that came from my throat was a croak. With unexpected resolve, Victor lunged forward and embraced the queen. She merely smirked, not expecting a real threat from him. But then came the explosion, hurling me to the other end of the hall filled with red light from the blast, and everything happened with incredible speed. My head spun, but my thoughts were consumed only by Victor's sacrifice. The bitterness of loss engulfed my soul, and tears involuntarily streamed down my face. Lying on the floor, I surveyed the spot where Victor and the queen had been, but now there was only emptiness. Shards of the shattered throne, dust, blood, and debris. In my heart, there was only one thought: endless gratitude and sorrow for the loss of a new friend whose sacrifice was too great. Getting to my feet, overcoming pain and limping, I headed for the exit from the castle. Along the way, I encountered no one, and finally I stepped out onto the street. My first glance was towards the sky, where the first rays of dawn began to tint the darkness with warm hues of morning light. At that moment, as I breathed in the cool air of the new day, a noise came from my left, and I saw Rob approaching, accompanied by other townspeople. Victory played on their faces, but I, aware of the price we had paid for it, couldn't fully share their joy. Rob ran up to me, lifting his shirt to reveal his wrist. The rose mark had disappeared. I looked at my own hand and with relief found that I no longer bore the sign either. Telling Rob about what had happened and Victor's sacrifice, I saw understanding and respect flash in his eyes for the fallen hero. "We will never forget him," he promised. And I knew it was true. Less than an hour later, a crowd gathered on the central square, ready to leave this place forever. The mayor announced that it was time to gather belongings and depart. I stood among the crowd, watching as people, filled with hopes for a new life, crossed the gates and headed into the unknown, illuminated by the first rays of the morning. At that moment I felt a strange calmness. Sadness for the lost friend mingled with the realization that we had done the impossible, freed ourselves from the curse, and paved the way for a new era for this town and its inhabitants. Victor's sacrifice had not been in vain, and his name would live on in the hearts and memories of everyone who today walked through these gates towards a brighter future. And as the last residents disappeared from sight, I turned one last time, looking at the castle, which now seemed less menacing in the light of the rising sun. Then I turned and followed the others, towards a new life, towards new hope, carrying in my heart the memory of the past and dreams of the future. Story 2. In the place where I live, it often rains. I don't know. Maybe that's why people in our city are always so gloomy. Just now, an old couple passed by, wearily splashing through puddles. The woman walked alongside, babbling something to her husband, whose face seemed to say, "Damn, I'm so fed up with everything." Behind them walked a middle-aged lady with a wrinkled nose, constantly sniffing and looking around, followed by a 5-year-old child. He joyfully jumped from puddle to puddle in red rubber boots, creating splashes of mud that flew, including onto his mother. Meanwhile, I sat by the window in a cozy diner, apathetically watching this gray picture. Suddenly I remembered how one of my acquaintances once speculated about why life in this city was so dreary. According to him, the Petersons were to blame. Who are they, you might ask? They are our neighbors. The town of Peterson was not far from us, just 10 miles amidst mountains and forests. Rumor had it that very strange people lived in this mysterious place. Some even said they were involved in Satanism or something like voodoo. Hardly anyone from our town goes there, and the residents of that town themselves don't visit us either. So, according to my acquaintance, although okay, I won't deceive you, I heard this story in a bar. It was told by one drunkard to everyone. So, according to him, the neighboring town seemed to suck the energy out of ours. When I heard this, I laughed out loud in the bar, but soon fell silent, realizing I was the only one laughing. How awkward it was. Goodness, people in this city are really superstitious, or do they really believe that Peterson is such a scary place? For me, it's all just stories, although I do keep one secret. The thing is, I'm originally from there. My father once lived in Peterson but ran away when he was young and begged me not to tell anyone about it. So I kept quiet, and as you can see, it paid off. Meanwhile, the rain outside intensified, creating a dense curtain of water through which it was difficult to see anything. I looked out the window, sipping coffee, when suddenly I saw a car stop on the other side of the street. A tall man got out of it, dressed in a dark coat, a white shirt with a starched collar, and black trousers. His ensemble was completed by polished shoes and white gloves. Elegantly opening an umbrella, he headed towards the diner. As he crossed the road, he glanced towards where I was sitting. Did he look at me, or was it my imagination? Soon he entered, shook off his umbrella, and without looking around headed towards me, leaving wet footprints behind. Hey, is he really coming to me? He stood opposite and bowed. I could see him closer now. He had a slender face, black eyes, and thin, dry lips, with a barely visible mustache above them. His face exuded elegance and pretentiousness. "Hello, Mr. Red. My name is Alaric Winchester. I work as a butler. I came to inform you that your uncle Edgar Ravenwood has passed away, and since he has no heirs, all his property is being transferred to you. You must now ride with me to Peterson, and there I will explain." Hey, wait a minute, buddy. I looked around and realized that everyone in the diner was silently watching us. "Damn," he said. "Peterson, that word is taboo in this city." I gestured for him to come closer, showing with my hand for him to lean in, and whispered, "Listen, pal, maybe we can talk somewhere else?" "We can talk in the car on the way," he said, not lowering his voice. Understood, this guy is unshakable. Well, I'll listen to what he has to say. I stood up, paid for the coffee, and left. The butler walked ahead, holding the umbrella over me while he himself walked under the pouring rain. I felt uncomfortable about this, so I quickened my pace. The butler opened the door for me, and before getting in, I took one last look at the diner and saw that all the customers were pressed against the window. Damn, looks like I'm in trouble. Rumors spread fast here, and everyone will find out that I have some connection to the neighboring town. Well, there's nothing I can do about it now. Getting into the car, I was surprised by how lavishly it was decorated. There was expensive upholstery, and when the door closed, I noticed golden or gilded handles on the doors. As I pondered this, the butler got behind the wheel and started the car. Then a light bulb went off in my head. This isn't a kidnapping, is it? Remember what all parents tell their children? Never get into a car with strangers. I asked the butler about this, but he didn't even smile, just shook his head. I had a bunch of questions in my head, and I started asking them, glancing at where he was taking me. "Maybe you'll tell me where we're going." "To my master's estate. There I will acquaint you with the will." "I see, but you understand that I only agreed to sit in the car and discuss matters." "I didn't agree to go with you," I said, grabbing him by the collar. "You have nothing to worry about. I am doing you a favor after all. You will inherit a vast fortune." "And how vast is that?" I asked with a sigh. "About 100 million. Give or take. You need to ask the accountant." So that's where I should have started. Did I hit the jackpot? I wonder what my late father would say about me becoming the heir to such a fortune. Apparently he had wealthy relatives, and they somehow found me. I looked out the window and realized we were leaving the boundaries of our town. As we progressed, urban landscape slowly gave way to rural countryside. Residential houses were replaced by farms sprawling on both sides of the road. Then, as if by magic, the forest began. As we progressed, the forest around us seemed darker and more ominous. Tree branches intertwined over the road, creating the illusion of a tunnel swallowed by twilight. However, soon this sinister landscape was replaced. Before us appeared the town of Peterson. It was a small town with a population of only 2,000 people, where the architecture evoked the spirit of medieval Europe. Stone buildings with sharp roofs, narrow streets framed by cobblestone sidewalks, and antique lanterns, creating a unique atmosphere. Unlike my hometown, the people here seemed kind and cheerful. Openness and hospitality were written on their faces, which was a pleasant surprise for me. We drove down the main street and soon found ourselves in the forest again. Gradually it began to thin out, and in the distance I saw a rocky mountain at the base of which was situated a huge castle. Like a little kid, I grabbed the front seats and leaned forward, marveling at the sight. Well, you must forgive me for this after all. It's not every day that you become the owner of such wealth. My emotions soared, intending to break the upper limit of the scale, setting the tone for my upcoming adventure. However, the butler paid no attention to my exclamations and continued driving with a serious expression. Approaching the castle, I could get a better view of it. It was an impressive structure made of dark stone, its tall towers and spires reaching for the sky, creating a sense of power and eternity. Sharp arches and stained glass added mystery to the building, while gargoyles perched on the edges of the roofs seemed like guardians of ancient secrets. The gates were open, inviting us in. Around the castle stretched a wide moat which in ancient times served as protection against unexpected guests. Now it was bridged, leading straight to the main entrance. From a distance, the castle seemed almost impregnable, but with each step closer, it revealed new details. Intricate carvings on the stone, complex patterns on the stained glass, and delicate wrought ironwork. We stopped at the entrance, and I didn't wait for someone to open the door for me, but got out myself. Looking at the butler, I noticed his clear dissatisfaction with this. Maybe by doing so, I was taking away his job. Next time, I should be more tactful. He led me up the stone staircase leading to the entrance. Entering the castle, I found myself surrounded by wealth that literally stunned me. The majestic foyer with high ceilings and massive stone columns opened the doors to a world of luxury and refinement for me. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor, strewn with expensive carpets, filling the vast hall with antique furniture and works of art. In the middle of the hall hung a huge portrait. From it, a 50-year-old man with a stern face looked at me. He was clean-shaven, with a powerful nature reflected in his eyes, and he wore a black top hat. It felt like he lived in the past century. Apparently, he was my late uncle. Soon the butler led me to the study. It was a spacious room with heavy curtains on the windows and a huge wooden desk in the center. Behind the desk were tall leather armchairs, and around the perimeter of the room stood massive bookshelves filled with ancient volumes and rare manuscripts. I sat at the desk and documents were brought to me. They stated that I would inherit everything, but on the condition that I perform a certain ritual that would last for 3 weeks. Alaric would tell me all the details. I looked up in surprise at the butler. What kind of ritual was this? I hoped it wasn't anything illegal. No, sir, it's quite unusual, but my late master had, so to speak, peculiar interests. Fortunately, they were all harmless. Okay. What, for example, do I have to do? Nothing complicated. Just read a book to the deceased by candlelight in the basement. What? What kind of nonsense is this? It sounds creepy. Spending nights with a dead person in a dark basement. He's not a vampire, is he? I hope not. Although I don't believe in things like UFOs, vampires, werewolves, and other nonsense. The scariest creatures are humans. And I learned this lesson when once a crowd of punks beat me up behind a bar at night. I read the contract again and told the butler that I agreed. Then a man came out of the door who turned out to be a notary. Apparently they knew I wouldn't refuse. I signed the papers, after which I was escorted to my quarters. It was a huge bedroom with a large bed. Preparation for the ritual would begin in a week, and for now I could do anything I wanted. I decided that in the morning I would explore the castle and go to the town. Before going to bed, I decided to call my boss, Mr. Stevenson, whom I worked for delivering fried chicken. Taking the phone, I found that there was no signal here. Odd. Okay, I'll call from town tomorrow. At night, I had a nightmare. I don't remember what was in it, but I woke up all sweaty. My heart was pounding wildly, and my breathing was rapid. I don't know what could have scared me so much, but I spent the rest of the night just tossing and turning. In the morning, feeling completely exhausted, I took a shower and went to have breakfast. The dining room was huge, with spacious seating, in the center of which was a long table, reminiscent of those seen in movies about aristocrats. The butler solemnly served me some dish, but as soon as I tasted it, my face twisted in disgust. What kind of slop was this? The butler said it was some aristocratic dish. Well, no way, I want a simple burger, but he shook his head. They don't serve that here." "Great." I asked him for the keys to the car, then headed to the garage. In the hangar, 5 impressive cars awaited me. In such moments, you realize how truly wealthy my uncle was. Pressing the button on the key fob elicited a response from the Porsche parked near the gates. Not a bad choice. Starting the engine, I left the castle grounds and soon found myself in the town. My search for a snack led me to the very center of Peterson. Looking around, I was surprised by the multitude of shops and crowds of people bustling about. I had no idea this town was so popular. I headed to a snack bar styled like a medieval tavern, which gave it a unique charm. Above the entrance hung a wooden sign neatly carved with symbols of beer and bread. Inside, I found myself in a cozy small space, with wooden tables and benches serving as furnishings and massive wooden beams adorning the ceiling. The walls were decorated with various shields and coats of arms, creating an authentic medieval atmosphere. There were no customers in the tavern except for a beautiful girl with fiery red hair tied neatly in a ponytail, who was diligently wiping the counter and setting utensils in place. Approaching closer, I noticed cute freckles adorning her face, and her eyes sparkled with green flecks in the sunlight. I immediately liked her and decided to strike up a conversation. "Excuse me, I'm new to this town. Why is there such a buzz outside the shops?" I asked the girl. She smiled at me and replied, "Our town is known for producing high-quality perfume, which is in high demand among connoisseurs. And today, we just received a new shipment." "Ah, I see," I responded. "Maybe you'd like to order something?" she asked. "What do you have?" "I wouldn't mind a burger," I said. "Yes, of course. What will you be drinking?" "Just a cola, by the way. My name is Mike." I reached out my hand. To my delight, she shook my hand in return. "And I'm Sarah. Nice to meet you. Are you passing through town?" "No. I'm staying at the castle nearby," I replied. To which she sighed in surprise. "Oh, so you're the relative of the late Mr. Ravenwood?" I nodded, and she continued, "He was quite well known in our town, and the residents held him in high regard. So, apparently, my uncle was quite popular here. He was very wealthy, and that already sets you apart from the rest." While Sarah went to fulfill the order, a family couple entered the snack bar, both in their 40s, both brunettes, with pleasant faces adorned with smiles. They approached the counter and greeted me. I nodded in response, and they went into the kitchen. Soon, Sarah came out with the order. While I was eating, we struck up a conversation. It turned out that the couple who entered the snack bar were the owners, Mary and Ted Jeffersons. Sarah worked here and also happened to be the daughter of the owners of the perfume shop across the street. She also told me a lot of interesting things about this town. It has a fairly close-knit community that supports each other. The main sphere of activity is perfume production, and it's so good that clients come from all over the world. However, it's not sold to everyone. To get on the list, you need to have certain connections. People here don't look favorably upon modern technology. They live a lifestyle similar to the Amish, but not as radically. They use cars, some household appliances, but when it comes to information technology like the internet and television, they are prohibited. I checked my phone and realized that there was no signal even in town. Sarah didn't even have a mobile phone. It was really strange. Maybe the locals want to shield their children from the influence of the modern environment. I still didn't understand. Maybe it's because of such quirks that they are not liked in my hometown. While we were talking, another person entered the snack bar. He was a guy in his 20s, a little older than me, blonde, quite tall and handsome. He walked past us, waving to Sarah, and headed towards the kitchen. That's Alex, the son of the owners, Sarah said. We've been friends since childhood. He doesn't really resemble his parents, I remarked. Well, that's quite typical for our town, she said. I don't look like mine either. Strange indeed. By the way, when I came to this place, I often found myself repeating this word. Strange. I finished eating and thanked Sarah, then asked where I could make a call. You need to go further down the street. You'll see the administrative building there. It's tall and beautiful. You'll recognize it right away. That's the town hall. There will be a grumpy man sitting at the entrance. His name is Howard. Don't pay attention to his words, just ask to use the phone. He won't refuse. I see, thanks. I'll probably come here every day since the food they serve at home is simply awful. Sarah smiled and nodded. After that, I walked out onto the street in high spirits and headed in the direction she indicated. Soon I found a large building made of red brick. The entrance door was tall. I pulled the handle and it was open. When I entered, I found myself in a long hallway. Walking along it, I found myself in a large room decorated with wood. Portraits of different people hung on the walls. Surprisingly, right in the center, on a prominent place, hung a portrait of my uncle. Did he own this town? To the right was a door with a sign that read Mayor. Next to it was a desk where a man in his 40s was sitting, slightly hunched over, with small, unpleasant eyes and a big nose. He looked at me as if to say, "What's this idiot doing here?" "Excuse me, could you please let me use your phone? There's no signal in town and I urgently need to contact someone." He sighed heavily and looked at me disapprovingly. "Ah, here we go. Everyone needs something here. Everyone's in a hurry. Well, the town without communication, and it seems I'm the last lifeline here. All right, tell me the number. But remember, I'm not a rescue service to jump at your first call." After dictating the number to him, he handed me the receiver. The phone was old-fashioned with a cord and I couldn't wander far. Howard, on the other hand, showed no signs of not intending to listen to my conversation. On the contrary, he stared at me, cocking his ear upward. It was slightly comical. But then someone picked up the phone on the other end. "Hello, I'm listening." "Boss, it's me. There's a situation." I didn't even finish my sentence before Mr. Stevenson started shouting through the receiver, clearly angry. He demanded to know where I had disappeared to, and complained about having to find a replacement for me. I pulled the receiver slightly away from my ear and noticed that Howard seemed to enjoy the scene. After the boss calmed down, I briefly explained to him that I had some unforeseen matters and that I was resigning. "I see. I don't know what's going on with you, but make sure to visit your aunt. She asked about you yesterday." "Yes, thank you, boss. I was planning to visit her soon." With that, the conversation ended and I handed the receiver back to Howard. He smirked unpleasantly and pulled out a newspaper as if signaling for me to leave. I silently left and headed to my car. Then I returned to the castle. So passed the week. For lunch, I would drive into town to see Sarah. Each time, we would chat about various things, after which I would take dinner with me and return to the castle, where I would either wander around studying the architecture or simply sleep. Unfortunately, my sleep schedule was disrupted because I kept having nightmares every night that I couldn't remember. In the morning, I would wake up exhausted, so I had to sleep during the day. This situation really bothered me, but I kept repeating to myself like a mantra, 100 million, 100 million, and it helped a little. Actually, there wasn't much to do in the castle. It was boring, so I started going into town for dinner as well. Sarah and I became close friends. She told me about her years in Peterson, and I, in turn, told her about the outside world. Surprisingly, she didn't know a lot of things, probably because they didn't have a television. She read a lot, and her favorite author was Jules Verne. She dreamed of traveling, but it was forbidden for them to leave the town. This restriction bothered me. After all, she was already 20, the same age as me. It turned out that their coming of age happens at 22, after which they leave their town. But they can't go wherever they want. They have to attend university, which is located in the north of the country, where supposedly another community lives. People in this town were very kind and cheerful, unlike in my hometown, where everyone walked around with gloomy faces. Smiles never left people's faces here. Once I became curious about how the locals produced perfume, so I asked Sarah if I could visit their workshop. She said she would ask her parents. It would be great if they agreed. It would somehow diversify the gray weekdays. But with each passing day, an important event approached. Every Sunday, I had to perform a ritual, as stated in the will. Honestly, I was a little scared. The whole thing seemed suspicious. And so, the Sunday evening came when the clock showed 11:45. Someone knocked on my door and the butler entered. He asked me to follow him. On the way, we passed through halls illuminated by candles hanging along the walls. Yesterday, there were electric lamps here. It was interesting why they now lit candles. I continued to follow Alaric and nervously looked around. There was a mysterious and ominous atmosphere in the air. We passed through places familiar to me which I had explored over the past week, and approached a door that had previously been locked. When the butler opened it, I saw a staircase leading down, along which candles were hung, illuminating the way. Descending it, I noticed that the basement was quite deep. We found ourselves in a huge room. It would probably be more appropriate to call this place not a basement, but catacombs. It was crossed by rows of columns, past which we walked until we reached a room, in the center of which stood a richly decorated wooden coffin, which was open. Around it, in a circle with a radius of about 10 feet, candles burned on tall candelabras. At the base of the coffin, near the head, stood an altar depicting an unknown creature with wings. I was surprised. Was it a vampire? I repeated these words to myself, not believing myself. When we entered the circle, I noticed a pentagram drawn on the floor with red paint. Was it really paint? Yes, it's not what I think it is it? To be honest, I was a little shaken. It was quite difficult to convey this gloomy atmosphere. Finally, we approached the coffin and I looked inside. There lay my uncle with his hands neatly folded on his chest as if he were immersed in prayer. His eyes were closed, creating the illusion of having just fallen asleep. His face was slightly gaunt and dry, as if he had passed away just a day ago. Surprisingly, the body showed no signs of decomposition. Maybe he was cremated? As I examined his face, I noticed that he was dressed in an exquisite suit. Alaric handed me a book and began to explain how to perform the ritual. I was supposed to stand by the coffin and read the incantation until 3 in the morning, trying not to be distracted. Then, when the gong sounded, I would have to spill a drop of blood on the altar. Here I objected. No one had previously mentioned that I had to harm myself. The butler tried to reassure me, assuring me that only a drop was needed. He handed me a small blade wrapped in sterile paper. I looked at it, pondering what to do next, and reluctantly took it. I thought a drop of blood wouldn't hurt me much, but I still felt uneasy. After that, the butler left the room, and I glanced at the clock. There were 5 minutes left until midnight. I decided to familiarize myself with the book. It was bound in old black leather, decorated with various symbols and pentagrams. Opening it, I found text in an unknown language, but there was a transcription written in small print on top. I flipped through the pages, and there were various creepy pictures. For example, one of them showed a group of people standing in a circle, in the center of which hung a person who seemed to be levitating unconscious as his limbs hung down. There were many other strange pictures. It all smelled of some kind of Satanism. But before I could dwell on this topic, the gong sounded. It meant it was time to start reading. I opened the book and began uttering the words unknown to me. At first it was difficult to pronounce them, but with time I improved. Occasionally glancing at the body, I realized my knees were shaking. Devil. What had I gotten myself into, and why was I so scared? I kept reading, and after about half an hour, my lips and tongue hurt from the unfamiliarity. But I didn't stop, repeating my mantra to myself. 100 million. 100 million. As the time approached the end, I was already in a trance, paying no attention to what was happening around me. But suddenly, I felt a faint breeze. Looking around, I saw that the flame of the candles was flickering as if some spectral creature had flown in. A shiver ran through me, but I continued reading until the gong rang. I put the book aside, took out the blade, pricked my finger, and dripped it onto the altar. The candles flickered again, and then settled down. After that, I collapsed on the floor with relief. It was truly exhausting. The butler hadn't returned yet. While I waited, I decided to take one last look at the deceased's body. To my bewilderment, I turned my head. Strangely, it seemed to me that his hands were folded differently. I approached closer. Could he be alive? I don't know why, maybe I'm crazy, but I decided to put my ear to his chest and listen. Thump, 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 thump. I heard the sound and got scared, jerking away sharply. But then I realized it was the beating of my own heart. Well, I'm an idiot. Stepping away from the coffin, I waited for Alaric, who arrived a minute later. He took the book and led me back to my room. That night I couldn't sleep. Walking in the garden the next morning, it seemed to me that yesterday's events were related to someone else. It was so irrational for me. Fortunately, the ritual only happened once a week. I decided to go to town and have breakfast there. When I entered the diner, smiling, Sarah greeted me, waving. "Good news, my parents agreed to show you the workshop. Tomorrow I'll ask for a day off and we'll go there together." "Awesome, thank you," I said excitedly. "It's on me. What would you like?" It would be nice if you brought back a book about travels." "No problem, I was actually planning to visit my hometown next week." Sarah thanked me. Well, she helped me. And besides, it was nice when she smiled like that. We chatted a bit more and I returned to the castle where I slept all day. The next day, I stood in front of the shop called Night's Secrets. Soon Sarah approached me, and we entered. The shop was small, but every item seemed precious. Bottles with liquids of various colors stood on beautiful glass shelves. Several visitors came up and sprayed some on their wrists, inhaling deeply. Euphoria spread across their faces. I became curious and wanted to try it too, but a couple entered the room. It was Sarah's parents. They looked about 35 or 40, quite young. Both were brunettes and quite attractive, like a pair of models. Sarah didn't resemble them at all. They approached me with wide smiles, shaking my hand. The woman spoke first. "Welcome, young man. We're always glad to meet Mr. Ravenwood's relatives. Your name is Mike, right? I'm Eleanor, and this is Victor. We've been wanting to meet you for a long time." "Thank you, ma'am." I was a little embarrassed by such a meeting. "I'll stand at the counter and you can show them everything," Sarah's father said. After that, Eleanor led us to the back room. Walking down the corridor, we stood in front of a massive oak door, behind which a staircase leading down began. Descending, we found ourselves in a room illuminated by soft lamplight, filled with the aromas of essences and oils. The walls were lined with shelves of bottles and flasks of various shapes and sizes, each containing a unique scent. In the center of the room was a long table. The air was filled with a multitude of scents, from heavy and rich to light and airy, creating an incredibly complex yet harmonious bouquet. Next to each workstation were small scales, meticulously measuring each component, and glass stirrers. Antique books and notebooks with perfume formulas were scattered throughout the room, some of which seemed to hold secrets dating back centuries. In the corner of the room, I noticed complex distillation equipment, where the purest and most concentrated aromatic oils were slowly and carefully extracted. Hanging in the center of the room was a portrait, and it was him again, my uncle. Maybe he was a local sponsor, or more likely that was the case. I pushed these thoughts aside and began wandering around the room, examining the books and instruments. Soon Sarah's mother began showing the production process. She started with how the best ingredients are carefully selected. Every component here is the result of careful attention, she explained, pointing to the shelves of bottles filled with essential oils and extracts. Then Eleanor showed how these components are combined in strict proportions. Creating perfume is an art that requires perfection at every stage, she said, carefully blending oils in a special mixer to achieve the perfect aromatic combination. And most importantly, in our work, there's a secret ingredient that's passed down to us as an inheritance. Taking a test tube with oils, she dripped from a pipette filled with shiny red liquid. When the red drop reached the oils, I noticed a small puff of smoke, and I swear, I thought I saw a skull in it. What kind of secret ingredient was this? I asked her, but she put her finger to her lips, winked at me, and said it was a secret. After the mixture was blended, it was sent to mature in a specialized room, where the scent developed its true depth and richness. This process can take from several days to several months depending on the specific perfume, noted Eleanor, passing by the glass bulbs containing darkening liquids. In the end, she demonstrated the stage of bottling the finished perfume. We watched as the equipment carefully filled each bottle, after which they were sealed and labeled. Each bottle is a message from us to the world, said Eleanor, handing me one of the bottles. We aim for our scents to evoke memories, dreams, and even inspire new stories. Wow. It felt like I was at some kind of performance. When it was all over, we headed towards the exit, and there Victor asked, "So, how was it?" "Amazing," I replied, thanking them for their time. After that, Sarah and I decided to take a walk and explore the city. It took up the whole day, but I had a great time. The week flew by quickly. I continued to visit the town, where I would have lunch or just stroll around, then return to the castle. During my visits, I noticed that there were no hotels in this town. Visitors quickly bought what they needed from the shops and left. Some of them even had frightened faces as if they knew something. It was suspicious. This town was hiding something. I was sure of it. But what? Honestly, it was hard to suspect these kind and sweet people. My nightmares intensified. Now they became clearer, and it seemed like I would remember what I dreamt of just a bit more. It was stressing me out. I even thought about sleeping somewhere else. But it was forbidden by the contract. In such moments, I continued to repeat my mantra about money. It was already past midnight when I stood with a book in my hands and read what seemed to be a spell. I even thought the corpse would soon rise and ask what time it was. Okay, no jokes, I was actually scared. When I saw the body this time, it seemed fresher. Or was all this the result of lack of sleep? I decided not to think about it and finish quickly and get out of here. When the gong rang and I dripped a drop of blood onto the altar, I saw the familiar draft, making the candle flames tremble. After that, terrifying screams sounded from somewhere. What was that? I was horrified, looking around but saw nothing. Soon the butler returned, and I finally left that place. The next day I woke up around noon. I could only fall asleep towards the morning. After taking a shower, I decided to head to the city. Passing by the houses, I saw that they were festively decorated. Flowers and posters with congratulations were everywhere. Congratulations on coming of age. I looked around in bewilderment, surprised by the scale of the celebration. When I reached the diner, I met Sarah there. Taking a seat, I ordered lunch and started to wait. Suddenly, I felt the need to use the restroom, so I went, and when I returned, I saw an envelope lying where I had been sitting. I picked it up and turned it in my hands. There were no inscriptions on it. At that moment, Sarah brought me food. I pointed out my find to her. "Do you know who could have left this?" "I don't know. It seems like nobody was here," she replied. "Weird." I sat down and began to open it, asking in the process, "What's the celebration going on outside?" "Yes, you don't know. Today is Sophia's coming-of-age ceremony. I don't know if you've met her. Remember I told you that when someone in this town turns 22, they're sent to study at Moonhaven. Because of this, the city administration holds a celebration. Today at 3 p.m., there will be an initiation ceremony on the square. We can go there together." I looked at her as she enthusiastically talked about the process, but for some reason, I had a bad feeling. And I asked, "Has anyone ever come back from there?" Sarah thought for a moment and replied, "No, I don't remember anyone like that. But the parents of those who left often visit them and say that after graduation they stay up north. They describe this place as the best on earth, and no one wants to leave." It all sounded kind of utopian. Opening the envelope, I found a note inside, written in beautiful calligraphic handwriting. Here's what it said: "You are in mortal danger. If you want to survive, you must uncover the secret of this town. To do this at 3 p.m., when everyone will be at the celebration, sneak into the town hall and explore the archives." That was the end of the warning. I turned the paper, trying to find more. Was this some kind of joke? I showed the note to Sarah. She read it and had a surprised and wary expression on her face. "What do you think about this?" I asked. "I don't even know. It could be a prank, but why not go and check?" I pondered. What if I really was in danger? Then, remembering what I had been doing at night in the basement, I decided to find out what this secret was after all. Sarah and I stayed in the diner until 2:30, then, closing it, pretended to take a stroll and headed towards the town hall. We waited for a while to make sure there were no outsiders. Apparently, everyone had already gathered in the square, and then headed towards the entrance of the large red brick building. Before entering, I looked around. It was clear. Pulling the handle, I realized it wasn't locked. We slipped inside and walked down the corridor until we reached the familiar room with portraits and the table. I expected that grumpy man to be sitting behind it, but he wasn't there. Where could the archive be here? Sarah pointed me to the door opposite the mayor's office. I pulled the handle. Surprisingly, it was unlocked, as if someone intentionally left it open. Stepping inside, we found ourselves in a large archive, where rows of tall shelves stretched up to the ceiling, laden with folders and documents. Carefully trying not to make unnecessary noise, we began to search for information among the dusty shelves. Soon Sarah quietly called me over. Approaching her, I saw that she was holding a folder with documents about children. They were old records neatly filed containing names, birth dates, and other important information. There was Sarah's card, too, stating that she was from North Carolina and her parents died in a car accident. I looked at Sarah, who had a detached expression. It was hard to accept, finding out that your parents aren't real. I put my hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her, which brought her back to her senses, and she continued to sort through the cards, then looked at me with fear in her eyes. Here are all the children living in the town. It turns out they're all adopted. It was a shock. So all the residents of this town were infertile, or what does this mean? We continued our search, but found nothing significant. After putting everything back in its place, we left the building and headed to the square. Sarah walked with her head down, lost in thought. I was trying to figure things out too. It was no wonder that neither she nor Alex, the son of the diner's owners, resembled their parents. Everything fell into place. Now we needed to understand why they couldn't have their own children. Maybe it's some kind of cult. I wonder if they abducted the children or if it was legal adoption. Lost in my thoughts, we didn't notice how we reached the square. The ceremony was already ending, and I saw a young blonde girl standing on a high stage, waving happily to everyone. Next to her stood a tall, stunning woman in a business suit. I asked Sarah who it was, and she didn't answer right away, as if lost in thought. "That's the mayor of the town," she said, again lost in her thoughts. Poor thing. It takes time to digest such news. Soon people started dispersing, and we headed towards the diner. Suddenly, I felt like there was something in my pocket. Putting my hand in, I pulled out an envelope. Suddenly, I sharply turned around, feeling someone's presence, but there was absolutely no one around. How could I have missed the moment when someone, unnoticed by me, slipped me an envelope? Tearing it open, I found a note inside that read, "Well done. Now you must visit the Forgotten Garden at midnight. It's dangerous, so sneak in unnoticed." I started looking around again. Someone was watching us, but who? I showed the letter to Sarah, and we decided that we must uncover the secret. Returning to the castle, I looked for the butler, but he was nowhere to be found. Where did he disappear to? In the evening, I returned to the town again. Driving down one of the streets, I saw Sarah, who was waiting for me, head bowed and lost in thought. We left the car and walked to the outskirts of the town where the Forgotten Garden was located. This place was carefully hidden behind an old stone bridge in the most secluded corner of the town park. The garden was surrounded by tall, densely intertwined trees forming a natural wall that concealed it from prying eyes. In the center of the garden was a small clearing with an ancient circle of stones resembling megaliths. We sneaked in and realized that nobody was there yet. There was still an hour until midnight, and we decided to find a hiding spot. To the right of the clearing were dense bushes where we climbed. Sarah told me that they often played here in their childhood, but she had no idea that something strange was happening here at night. What exactly? We were soon to find out. Closer to midnight, we heard footsteps, and figures dressed in cloaks emerged onto the clearing. There were about a dozen of them. They spread out in a circle, after which the last person in a cloak emerged from behind the trees, leading a captive bound with ropes. "Sophia," whispered Sarah. I looked closer and recognized the blonde girl I saw today in the square. What were they going to do? Does this mean they do belong to some kind of cult? While I was contemplating, They led the captive to the center of the circle. She looked around in fear, tears streaming down her face, asking why, for what. It was a horrifying sight. I thought we should intervene, but most likely, we would have been caught. Soon, people began chanting hymns in an unknown language. Listening closely, I realized they sounded similar to the ones I read in the basement. Suddenly, the girl stopped crying and screaming. Her eyes became empty, after which she was abruptly lifted upwards as if there was a rope tied to her waist, her limbs hanging down, and she floated in the center of the circle. Seeing this scene, Sarah tried to break free from the bushes. I managed to grab her and cover her mouth. "Stay. You can't help her." She struggled, but then what happened next made her freeze. The hoods fell from the heads of the people, revealing their faces. I recognized most of them. It was the mayor of the town, that grumpy man who worked as her secretary. And there was my butler Alaric, so that's where he disappeared to. But there were also those who shocked Sarah, her parents. They continued chanting the incantation when suddenly a red essence burst out of the girl's body. It wasn't blood, but something in the form of gas. It streamed out in thin jets and flowed towards the figures. Meanwhile, the girl's body began to wither right before our eyes. At the end, the last jet burst out of her and hung in the air, spinning and contracting until it turned into a liquid. Sarah's mother approached and held out a flask, and the red, shiny substance flowed into it. That was the secret ingredient. Then the girl's body burst into flames, and it turned into ash, scattering in the wind. My God, everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to be scared. But fear slowly began to creep into my mind. I looked at Sarah, who was pale and had wet eyes. The procession began to disperse slowly, when suddenly one figure looked in our direction. Perhaps he heard the noise in the bushes and decided to check. It was that grumpy man, Howard. I thought it was the end for us, as he got closer and closer to us. Then we jumped up and ran. We heard shouts behind us and realized we were being chased. We ran as fast as we could through the park, but we felt like we were being chased. Sarah started falling behind. Then suddenly, ahead of us, we saw a figure waving to us. It was Ted Jefferson, the owner of the diner. We hurried towards him. He stood at the entrance to an underground grotto, hidden from view, holding a disguised door handle covered in grass. As we approached, he shouted for us to jump inside. Without hesitation, we leaped in and he followed, closing the door behind us. The pit wasn't deep. We heard someone run past and held our breath. Soon everything went silent, and we breathed a sigh of relief. I looked at Ted, who simply said, "Follow me," and led the way out. We took back roads until we reached the town. There, we got into Ted's car and drove to the diner. When we entered, Mary, the owner, was waiting for us. Seeing our shocked faces, she asked us to sit down and poured some tea. Then she said, "It seems you have a lot of questions. Of course, what was that in the park? And how did you know we would be there?" I exclaimed, visibly shaken. "I believe you've already guessed that it was us who sent you those letters. I'm sorry we put you in danger, but it was the only way to make you believe us," Mary said, looking at us in turn. "To understand what's happening here, we need to go back to the beginning. And it all started about 150 years ago. Your uncle, Edgar Ravenwood, was an ordinary man living in his castle at the time. Even then, his wealth was considerable. But suddenly he fell ill with an incurable disease. In search of a cure, Edgar invited the best doctors, but none of them could help him, leaving him hopeless. Then a mysterious stranger in a dark hooded cloak appeared, offering a cure for his illness. But the price of this healing was to be the life of Edgar's son. Your uncle, being a malicious man, albeit adept at hiding it from others, agreed without hesitation. The stranger took his son, but left him a book that contained the secret to eternal life. Studying it, your uncle uncovered many secrets. One of them was the method of producing perfume from the essence of human life, the very process you witnessed today. Moreover, consuming this essence allowed one to prolong their own life. Edgar needed followers and supporters who would sustain and enrich him. He didn't have to search for long. At that time, the villages were ravaged by plague, and finding those who wanted to live forever was not a problem. So he found us. Soon he gathered people who formed a settlement named after that stranger, who was called Gregory Peterson. Soon we began to consume the essence of people abducted from villages, thereby extending our lives. But over time, we encountered several problems. Firstly, we could no longer have children, which came as a shock to many. Some even ended their lives because of it. Secondly, to produce the perfume, we needed people with a special aura, untainted by life's hardships and problems. Otherwise, the scent of the essence was repulsive. Finding such people was difficult, so it was decided to abduct children and raise them in love and care, shielding them from the horrors of the outside world. As time passed, there were couples who, after raising a child, refused to sacrifice them. In those cases, they were simply executed. Initially, there were twice as many residents in this village. Only those who were cruel or frightened remained. Over time, we mastered the art of hiding our true emotions, displaying only kindness and smiles. Our perfume gained fame, bringing us not only profit but also the ability to prolong our lives. Wait, so you mean you're vampires? And why is my uncle lying in a coffin if you're immortal? I interrupted, unable to believe what was happening. You could call us vampires, but we don't have any special powers. Only your uncle is different. He gained power from the Elder, so he possesses superhuman abilities. Why did he die? Actually, he didn't. Right now, he's in a deep sleep. It's because of the curse. When he sold his own son, he was cursed, and every 50 years he enters a state of hibernation. If a blood relative doesn't recite the incantation and sacrifice themselves, he'll die. Wait, did you say sacrifice? I exclaimed in shock. So that's what you meant by danger in that letter. Exactly. When the final session is over, you'll perish. But wait, I don't have any children. So how will he perform the ritual next time? Oh, that's not a problem. You actually have plenty of blood relatives across the country. You were chosen because of your father. In reality, he was murdered. After these words, I looked at her in astonishment. My father was murdered, but why? I had a million questions swirling in my mind. I don't know the exact reason. Perhaps he knew some secret. All I know is that he lived in the castle and then he escaped. After her words, silence fell. We pondered what we had heard, trying to decide what to do next. But suddenly Sarah jumped up, trembling all over and clenching her fists, and angrily asked, "Why did you betray them? What's in it for you telling us everything, and why didn't you help Sophia?" Mary sighed heavily, and then Ted replied, "It's because of our son, Alex. We love him so much that we can't let him die. His birthday is next week, which means he'll perish. As for Sophia, we couldn't have helped her even if we wanted to. There's no escaping from here. You don't know how powerful these people are, and if you try to escape, they'll find you without much effort." After these words, I remembered how the butler found me the first time, as if he knew exactly where I would be. "So our only hope is to kill Edgar," Ted continued, "but the problem is, we don't know how. He's invulnerable. Many have tried to eliminate him, but it always ends in failure. If you don't know, how am I supposed to know? Perhaps your father knew something, so before Sunday arrives, you must find out. Otherwise, you'll perish, just like all of us. And you can't help us. Unfortunately, your uncle can control us, and we can't directly harm him." Wow, my whole world turned upside down in just one day. Vampires, conspiracies. If I were smarter, I would have understood everything sooner. Although, on the other hand, it's very hard to believe all of this. It was already late at night. I left the diner and headed to the castle. The butler wasn't there yet, so I went to my chambers. In the morning, rising early and starting up my Porsche, I headed to my hometown, Wilcrick. I needed to visit my aunt. As I drove, I thought about yesterday. So much had happened. I wondered about Sarah. I would have to visit her on the way back. Soon I found myself in my hometown, realizing how much I missed this place. Pulling up to my aunt's house, I parked opposite it. A few neighborhood boys ran up to me, marveling at my car. I climbed the porch steps and knocked. A woman in her 50s opened the door. It was Aunt Lucy. She wasn't actually related to me. She and my father were friends, and after his death, she looked after me. As I reached out for a hug, she just gave me a stern look and nodded for me to come in. Stepping into the kitchen, she poured me some coffee and asked irritably, "Where have you been? Why didn't you tell me anything? You know I've been worried sick. Maggie, my friend, was right about the troubles you'd bring." "Sorry, Auntie, I had urgent matters." I didn't tell her the details, not wanting to worry her. She kept probing for a while, trying to find out the truth, but then she sighed and said, "Well, the main thing is that you're alive and well, and that's all that matters." "I'm so glad to see you. Besides you, no one would have cared about me," I said. "Stop it, your Uncle Harry was worried too when you disappeared like that. Apologize to him for me. By the way, Auntie, I wanted to ask, did Dad leave anything behind after his death?" I asked. "So that's why you came, you scoundrel. I thought you missed your old aunt. Just a moment." She struggled to get up and headed to her bedroom, then returned holding something. "Here. It's your father's diary. I found it in a hiding spot he told me about, instructing me to give it to you only when you asked." I was surprised and thanked my aunt. We chatted for a bit, and then, saying our goodbyes, I left. Leaving town, I pulled over to the side of the road and began to read the diary. In it, my father recounted his life, how he met my mother, how I was born, his thoughts and experiences. It was a treasure trove of memories for me, but I was looking for something to help me at that moment, and finally found it. Here's what was written there. "Son, if you're reading this diary, it means my fate has caught up with you. You probably already know about it, but I'm from Peterson and grew up with Uncle Edgar. My childhood was happy. I didn't know any worries, and the people around me were always glad to see me. But one day, I saw something I shouldn't have. I learned the terrible secret of this town when I was 10 years old, and it turned my life upside down. I decided to escape, but before that I had to gather information that would help me in the future. For 5 years I watched Uncle Edgar, searched the entire castle for his secrets, and one day found a book. This book was his strength, but at the same time, his weakness. I noticed that one page was torn out of the book, and I suspected it wasn't just a coincidence. I began searching for it, and eventually found it. It was hidden inside an ancient clock mechanism in the tower facing east. To access the hidden page, you need to manually activate the mechanism by turning certain gears in the right order. Below, I've drawn how to do it. But most importantly, it contains instructions on how to kill Uncle. You need to recite the incantation and thrust a stake of ash wood into his heart. Yes, the old legends were not lying. I left the page in place, afraid of arousing suspicion. After learning the necessary information, I fled from home. Surprisingly, no one searched for me, although I was literally under their noses. I'm sure they knew where I was, but left me alone. Although I'm sure that someday they'll come for me. I hope this information helps you. Forgive your wayward father for bringing you trouble, and remember, I always loved you. With these words, the message ended. His words touched me, making me contemplate for a while. Coming to my senses, I started the car and headed to Peterson. I needed to stop by the diner and discuss my find. When I entered, there were no customers, only Sarah standing at the counter. It reminded me of the moment I first met her, except then she was cheerful, and now she had a blank expression. I showed her the diary and she called the Jefferson couple. They were surprised by the discovery and at the same time pleased. We discussed the plan and decided to act immediately, without waiting for Sunday. First, Ted went to make the ashwood stake. We waited for him for half an hour, and he returned with it. It was about a foot long and looked very sharp and sturdy. Then Mary went to the pantry and pulled out a couple of pistols and an M4 rifle. Sarah and I were shocked. This couple was not as simple as they seemed. We packed the weapons and stake into a large bag and headed out onto the street. The Jeffersons asked us to wait for them a bit. When they returned, we got into the car and drove off. In 15 minutes, we were at the castle. Ted parked his pickup truck opposite the gates and we all got out. The butler rushed out to meet us. How did he know we were coming? He tried to block our way but received a sharp blow to the temple from Ted, knocking him unconscious. He fell, losing consciousness. Apparently they were right that the local vampires were no different from ordinary people. Dragging the butler inside and tying him up, we headed towards the tower. Climbing up, I started searching for the mechanism indicated in the diary and finally found it. Turning the gears, I heard a clicking sound, and a golden-trimmed chest emerged from the wall in front of me. When I opened it, a deafening alarm sounded similar to the one in emergencies. Ted's face paled and he shouted, "Damn, that's the danger signal. When it sounds, everyone in the town must rush here. We need to hurry." Quickly pulling out the page, we rushed down to the basement. When we reached the door, I pulled out the keys we took from the butler. My hands trembled as I sorted through them one by one until I finally heard the long-awaited click. The door opened and we headed down. Ted and Mary stayed at the entrance, ready to give resistance if needed. As we descended, we saw candles burning. We ran towards the coffin, deciding to hurry since a crowd of angry vampires was approaching the castle. The coffin stood in the same place. I handed Sarah the page to recite the incantation, as there was a transcription there too, while I took the stake intending to drive it in when she finished. Approaching, I was surprised by my uncle's transformation. His face looked fresher, but it was more sunken and his ears sharpened like an elf's. I didn't know why this happened. Perhaps this was his true form, but he looked terrifying. I stood on one side of the coffin, and Sarah stood on the other. Getting ready, she began to recite, while I, gripping the stake with both hands, pressed it against my uncle's chest around the heart. My hands were shaking. I tried to calm down and catch my breath after the run. Sarah continued to recite, and I thought it was the end, but suddenly someone grabbed my hand. It was my uncle. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and his razor-sharp teeth were inches from my face. He hissed, and I felt his incredible strength as he lifted into the air, taking me with him. Seeing what was happening, Sarah froze in shock for a moment. But my cry made her gather her strength and continue reading. While she recited the spell, I struggled with my uncle in the air, trying to keep the stake against his chest. My hands were shaking, but I gripped the stake tighter, while my mind searched for ways to defeat him. My uncle tried to push me away. His grip was like icy tongs, but in the depths of his gaze I saw a momentary hesitation. He seemed shocked by the situation. I seized this moment, gathering my willpower, and made a sudden lunge forward, increasing the pressure of the stake on his chest. Despite her fear, Sarah continued to recite the spell faster and more confidently. Her voice sounded like music in the chaos. As she neared the end, the air around us vibrated with magical energy. Desperately, my uncle tried to fly higher with me, but I knew this was his last chance to escape fate. When Sarah uttered the last words of the spell, the air around us ignited with a bright light, and I felt the magical force strike my uncle. In that moment, I gathered all my strength and thrust the stake directly into his heart. His cry of desperation and pain shattered the silence of the night. His body began to slowly disintegrate into ashes, carried away by the wind until it disappeared completely. A moment later, I found myself standing on the ground, staring at the spot where I had just fought for my life. Sarah approached me, her eyes full of tears, but gratitude and relief were evident in them. We had won. The spell was spoken and my uncle was defeated. But our joy didn't last long. Gunshots rang out from above and we hurried towards the exit. At the entrance, the Jefferson couple stood, firing at a huge crowd of vampires. The mayor peeked out from behind a column, shouting that he wanted to talk, but Mary shouted that we wouldn't fall for that trick. Seeing us and realizing that we had completed the task, Ted informed his wife, who smiled happily. Then he pointed to the door on the right, whispering that they would distract the enemies, and we should run. This path would lead us to the exit bypassing the enemies, where the pickup truck was parked. When you leave here, be sure to take Alex with you and leave the town. In the trunk, you'll find 3 bags, one for each of you, with money that will help you for a while. Go as far away as possible and live happily, Ted said. But what about you? Sarah whispered. Our fate is to stay here and take as many of them as possible. Don't worry about us. But Ted interrupted her and forcefully dragged us to the exit while Mary opened fire, distracting the enemy. We opened the door and saw a long corridor. Sarah still hesitated, but Ted yelled, "Run now!" And we ran. I roughly knew the way, and bypassing the castle from the side, I breathed a sigh of relief. There was no one near the pickup. Getting into the car, I started it up and floored the gas pedal. We raced towards the town. Arriving at the diner, we found Alex there, who was worried and waiting for us. His parents had already told him the whole truth and ordered him to leave the town immediately. Meeting us and not finding his parents nearby, he couldn't hold back tears. We hurriedly helped him pack his things, and then we all left the town together. As soon as we arrived in Will Creek, I immediately approached the nearest payphone and called the police. In the conversation, I decided not to delve into the supernatural details and focused on more earthly matters. I reported that there were kidnappings happening in Peterson and that there was currently a shootout at the castle. I also added a few other details to give my words more weight. After this incident, we left those parts forever. What happened to that place after we left remains a mystery to me. News of the events in Peterson never reached us, and over time that place became a distant memory, shrouded in rumors and speculation in my mind. Story 3. One day, I received an unexpected notification from a lawyer. Upon meeting him, I was stunned by the news. My late uncle had left me a house. It was so unexpected that I could barely hide my surprise. After all, my uncle and I had never been particularly close. However, besides me, he had no other heirs. My heart was filled with both pity for my departed relative and curiosity about the house that had been passed down to me. After signing all the necessary documents and learning the address, I decided not to go there alone and invited my friends. Mike, my best friend, offered to drive us in his car. I sat in the front seat, while Sarah, my childhood friend, and Thomas, my clumsy but loyal friend, sat in the back. Soon we arrived at the place, and before us stood a mansion forgotten by time. It was an old American house, frozen in the past. Its exterior was impressive, a two-story structure with Victorian features, tall windows framed by faded shutters, and a majestic door with a bronze knocker. The roof was adorned with a curved metal weather vane, which seemed to point the direction to our adventure. Surrounding the house was an ancient garden, where no one had tended to in a long time. Wild bushes intertwined with grapevines and majestic but clearly neglected trees. In the backyard, a small gazebo could be seen, overgrown with moss and ivy, as if inviting us to uncover its secrets. We approached the main door, and Mike, noticing the bronze knocker next to it, cautiously knocked on it, as if expecting someone to answer. The echo of the knock slowly dissipated into silence. Sarah gave him a disapproving look and sighed. "Well, let's just go in already." I turned the key in the lock, and with a creak, the door opened slightly. Inside, we were greeted by a cool, dusty air that hadn't felt the presence of living beings for a long time. First, we found ourselves in a spacious hall adorned with antique portraits and heavy curtains, through which the light barely penetrated. The floor was paved with mosaic tiles, the patterns of which depicted intricate geometric figures. To the left was the living room. Inside stood massive leather armchairs facing a fireplace, which had long ceased to have a fire. Shelves with dusty books lined the walls, as if they held forgotten stories of the past. In the corner of the room stood a gramophone, next to it, a stack of old records. Thomas, unable to contain his curiosity, approached it and turned the handle, but only a squeak and silence responded. Next, our path led to the dining room, where a large oak table proudly occupied the center of the room, surrounded by high chairs. Above the table hung a massive chandelier, covered in cobwebs, as if its crystal pendants hadn't emitted light for many years. Beyond the dining room was the kitchen, where antique utensils and dishes were still arranged as if the owners had just left the room. A winding staircase with intricately carved wooden railings led to the upper floor. Upstairs, we were greeted by a long corridor with rows of doors leading to bedrooms. Each room was unique. One concealed a vast library, another an observatory with an ancient telescope pointed towards a faded window. In the last room, which seemed to serve as a study, we found an old writing desk cluttered with old papers. While we explored the upper floors, Mike stayed downstairs, and apparently, his spirit of exploration couldn't be contained. Suddenly, his piercing and excited voice shattered the silence of the old house, prompting us to interrupt our journey into the past. "Come down! You have to see this!" he shouted from the hall. We hurried downstairs, where we found him standing next to a small, inconspicuous door that was well hidden in the shadow under the staircase. He opened the door leading to the basement, and we followed him down the creaky wooden steps, where we were met with a scene straight out of a detective novel. The basement was dimly lit by a bulb hanging from a long wire, giving the room a gloomy yet captivating appearance. The walls were covered with photographs and notes connected by colored threads into a complex web of relationships. At first glance, it resembled a detective's wall, trying to solve a complex case. In the center of the room stood an antique wooden table, piled with stacks of documents, old newspapers, and personal letters, each of which seemed to hold a part of the history of this house and its last owner. There were also several maps on the table, covered with various marks and notes in the margins. In the corner of the room stood a dusty projector and a stack of old slides, which possibly contained additional clues or information. Approaching the wall, I began to examine the photographs carefully. They depicted various places, from serene village views to gloomy corners of a cemetery. One photograph particularly caught my attention, a small but imposing chapel, which seemed shrouded in mystery. Nearby hung various notes, and on one of them I read, "Every 50 years or so, there was such an inscription. The chapel is of significant importance." These words instantly set off a whirlwind of conjectures and assumptions in my mind. My attention shifted to a photograph of a huge statue, whose outlines resembled a person with bat-like wings. The face of the statue, adorned with vampire fangs, looked so realistic that for a moment I caught myself thinking about the skill of the creator of this work. What master could achieve such detail with such precision? I thought to myself. But my thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's voice. She stood at the table, pointing to the map spread out before us. "I know this place," she said, her voice full of confidence. The map showed a forest located at the foot of the mountains, not far from the neighboring town. Recalling local legends, I realized that this forest had always been shrouded in secrets and rumors of unexplained phenomena. As we explored the room, filled with mysteries and untold stories, Mike suddenly suggested, "What if we head there this weekend? We don't have any plans anyway." His suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to all of us, stirring excitement and a desire for adventure. After a short pause, during which each of us weighed the risks and opportunities, Sarah was the first to express her agreement. After her, like dominoes, the rest followed suit. I agreed too, curious as to why my uncle was so interested in this place. Continuing our inspection of the house, we climbed back up to the second floor, where in one of the offices I stumbled upon my uncle's diary. Its antique cover and tattered pages promised to reveal much about the life of the last owner of this mysterious house. This may give us some answers, I thought, putting the diary in my bag to read later in a more tranquil setting. We also took the map, which had become the key to our next adventure. Sunday arrived, the day we had been eagerly awaiting all week. The air was fresh and clean, as if nature itself anticipated our adventures. We agreed to meet at 8 in the morning, and as I sat in the kitchen, enjoying the quiet of the early hours, the sudden honk of a car horn disrupted the peace. Looking out the window, I saw Mike eagerly waving to me, standing next to his car. Grabbing my things, I quickly stepped outside and noticed that everyone was already in place. Among us was a newcomer, Jess, Sarah's friend, who greeted me with her characteristic smile. Sitting in the front seat next to Mike, I surveyed our companions. Everyone was filled with determination and anticipation. We exchanged glances, in which readiness for the impending trials was evident. Mike started the car, and we slowly set off, leaving the familiar streets of our town behind. As the cityscapes outside the car window gave way to wild landscapes, the conversations in the car didn't die down. We discussed everything, from legends and myths associated with the forest at the foot of the mountains to what we hoped to find or decipher. Jess, being a new member of our team, listened to the tales of our recent exploration of my uncle's house with visible curiosity, sometimes asking questions that made us look at already known facts from a new perspective. As the landscapes outside the car window changed, I decided to read my uncle's diary, which was like a portal into his past. Flipping through the pages, I delved into his thoughts, experiences, and suddenly, my attention was drawn to entries about the statue in the forest. My uncle began his story with the words, "I stumbled upon this village completely by accident. After surveying it, I soon realized that it harbored something unusual, a mystery that I was to unravel. My investigation began with the archives, where I discovered that the village had been abandoned about 45 years ago. But it would be more accurate to say that at a certain point, all its inhabitants, about 200 people, simply disappeared without a trace. This discovery shook me to the core. My desire to solve this mystery only intensified. Continuing my work with the archives, I came across a police report, which indicated that real disasters had occurred in the village. The report spoke of clear signs of struggle, of panic that apparently gripped the inhabitants. It was obvious that something terrible had happened here. However, there were no traces of where the residents could have disappeared to, or what exactly had happened. Reading these lines, I felt my heart beating faster. In my uncle's diary, it wasn't just an exploration of an abandoned village, but a real investigation, full of secrets and unsolved mysteries. Continuing to read the diary, I discovered that my uncle, immersing himself in the investigation of the village, gradually uncovered its secrets. He wrote, "As evidence accumulated, it became clear that the village was a haven for cultists who worshipped an ancient deity. Images of this god I found everywhere, only enhancing the atmosphere of mystique surrounding this place. However, the presence of a chapel in the middle of the village became a new puzzle for him. Why, while worshipping another god, did they leave the chapel untouched? He wondered. Deciding to investigate this question, my uncle spent a considerable amount of money on carbon dating, which shed light on the history of the chapel. It turned out that it was several hundred years old and preceded the founding of the village itself. This discovery only added new questions to my investigation, he noted. In his quest to unravel the mystery, my uncle learned about the statue of a deity located deep in the forest not far from the village. The statue inspired awe and respect. Its scale and craftsmanship were truly impressive. It stood there, as if a guardian or a reminder of forgotten vows and faith. Opening the final pages of the diary, I found an entry where my uncle expressed confidence that the disappearance of the village's residents was somehow connected to the statue. "I am certain of this," he wrote, as if leaving us a message from the past. Then followed a description of a meeting with the sole survivor, a young man who in childhood witnessed horrifying events and was now in a psychiatric hospital. According to my uncle, the survivor's condition left much to be desired. He was withdrawn, and his gaze often drifted into emptiness, as if he saw things others couldn't. Attempts to ask about what happened in the village were met with incoherent babbling, from which only fragments about burning red eyes and advice to run to the chapel could be gleaned. The entries abruptly ended, leaving many questions unanswered. Why did my uncle stop his investigations? Looking at the dates in the diary, I was surprised to realize that exactly 50 years had passed since the mysterious events in the village. This number was also noted in the basement. What could it mean? Closing the diary, I leaned back in my seat and tried to make sense of everything I had read. Thoughts swirled in my head about the connection between the disappearance of the villagers, the statue, and the chapel. With every mile, civilization seemed farther and farther away. And the mysterious forest, which my uncle's diary spoke so much about, drew nearer. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest, where the road seemed to cease to exist, merging with the dense thickets. Mike carefully parked the car under the canopies of old trees, and we stepped outside. The air here was fresh and cool, saturated with the aromas of the forest and the earth. Gathering the necessary equipment, we entered the forest, leaving the car behind. Making our way through the forest thicket, we tried to navigate by the map we had brought with us. Rustling underfoot, birdsong, and the whisper of leaves merged into a single sound that accompanied us along the way. The sunlight barely reached the ground through the dense tree canopy, creating a mysterious interplay of shadows and light. We walked in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts and expectations of the impending discovery. After an hour of determined progress through the dense forest, we finally stumbled upon our first landmark, a small river, flowing calmly among the trees. Its water was cool and clear, and the banks were covered with soft moss and stones. According to my uncle, we needed to continue our journey along this river to reach the abandoned village. We decided to follow along the riverbank, enjoying the freshness and natural beauty. The sound of water accompanied us, filling our hearts with calmness, and at the same time the anticipation of something unknown. The river meandered among the trees, sometimes widening, sometimes narrowing, but invariably leading us forward, toward the goal of our journey. After walking for some distance, we began to notice changes in the landscape and vegetation. Trees became less dense, and underfoot appeared traces of an old road, overgrown with grass and moss, but still discernible among the forest cover. This was a sign that we were nearing our destination. As we walked suddenly, a sudden rustle from the side of the trail made us freeze in place. The heart pounded in my ears, and silence hung in the air, as if nature itself held its breath. Out of the bushes, a wild boar suddenly darted, and we barely managed to jump aside. The animal didn't look like ordinary members of its species. Its eyes glowed with bright red light, giving it a sinister and unnatural appearance. This sight etched itself into my memory, sending shivers down my spine. Mike reacted first and shouted for us to climb the nearest trees. In his hands he had a spray, apparently pepper spray, which he directed at the raging animal. Without wasting time, we scattered, quickly climbing the nearest branches. Mike stayed on the ground, face to face with the boar. As the enraged beast lunged at Mike, he calmly sprayed a stream of liquid directly into the boar's face and skillfully dodged the attack, then quickly climbed a tree. However, the spray only intensified the boar's rage. With bloodshot eyes, it repeatedly charged at the tree where Mike was hiding, ramming it with its head. We watched this scene, holding our breath, hearts pounding with fear. The animal seemed to feel no pain, its red eyes staring up at Mike. But suddenly, after another blow, the boar weakened. Its legs gave way, and it fell lifeless to the ground, forming a dark pool of blood around itself. The silence, interrupted only by our quickened breaths, once again enveloped the forest. We slowly descended from the trees, surveying the dead boar's body with undisguised horror. Examining the dead boar's body, we tried to find an explanation for its strange behavior. "Maybe rabies?" suggested one of us. But the burning red eyes didn't fit the framework of a typical illness. We exchanged conjectures, but none seemed convincing enough. This incident added darker shades to our adventure, and we cautiously continued our journey, delving deeper into the shadows of the forest. Regaining our composure after the unexpected encounter, we followed along the old road, which, as it seemed to us, should lead us to the abandoned village. Dry leaves rustled underfoot, and around us reigned such silence that it seemed as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of our next move. As we progressed, the landscape began to change. Trees became less dense, allowing more sunlight to penetrate. And then, after an exhausting hour of travel, we finally emerged into a clearing, beyond which lay the place we were seeking. Before us lay the village, like a page from a long-forgotten history book, surrounded by silent forest. Every house, every structure here was shrouded in the veil of time and oblivion. Collapsed roofs, crumbling walls, doorways and windows filled with darkness seemed like portals to another world. Streets overgrown with tall grass and bushes wound between the buildings, creating a labyrinth that held echoes of the past. We moved slowly, carefully stepping on the uneven pavement, still feeling the eyes of unseen witnesses to our actions. The air here was saturated with the scent of antiquity and mold, and the silence was periodically broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant echo of our footsteps. Strange symbols engraved on stones and walls of some houses caught our attention. These signs, described by my uncle in his diary as symbols of an ancient god, were everywhere. They were incomprehensible, but at the same time they inspired awe. Especially one symbol, depicting a circle with rays radiating from the center, caught our attention. This sign, according to my uncle, was the main symbol of the cult worshipping an unknown deity. Trying to decipher the meaning of these symbols and their connection to the village's history, we found an altar in one of the houses. In the center of the ruined room, on a low pedestal, stood a stone covered with the same signs. Nearby on the ground lay candle stubs and pieces of fabric, presumably used in rituals. This place undoubtedly was the center of the cult, a place of worship and sacrifice. Continuing our exploration, we slowly made our way through overgrown streets until we reached the open square in the village center. Before us stood the chapel. Its walls, covered with moss and lichen, distorted with time, and the roof, under the weight of years, partially collapsed, allowing daylight to penetrate inside through the gaps. Approaching closer, we could see that what was once a monumental entrance now resembled more ruins than an invitation to enter. Inside, as expected from a building that had survived so many years of oblivion, there was emptiness and destruction. The air was filled with the smell of decay and earth, and the floor was littered with debris of wood and stone. Doubts about whether anything could have survived inside this ancient chapel seemed entirely reasonable. The interior space was almost emptied. There were no benches for worshippers, no altar, which once perhaps served as the central element of this sacred place. All that remained of its religious purpose were faded frescoes on the walls, barely discernible under layers of dust and cobwebs. Exploring the ruins, we found a small stone fragment under one of the collapsed walls, adorned with faded remnants of carving. This piece of stone, perhaps once part of a larger composition, now served only as a silent reminder of the chapel's former glory. In the back of the chapel was a door leading to a small room, which likely served as a storage for religious artifacts or a residence for the priest. The entrance was blocked by debris, and after some effort we managed to make our way inside. To our surprise, this room contained more than could have been expected, given the condition of the rest of the chapel. Several waterlogged and weathered books lay on the floor, their pages yellowed and crumbling to the touch. However, the texts were unreadable, their secrets lost forever. After exploring the village and the chapel, we found no significant discoveries. My uncle, who spent so many years here, would hardly have missed anything. Impressed by what we had seen, we soon grew hungry and decided to have a snack. We decided to take a short break on the edge of the village, where nature was once again beginning to reclaim its rights over the abandoned human space. From our backpacks, we pulled out thermoses with hot tea and coffee, as well as sandwiches that we carefully prepared the day before. Sitting on the ground, leaning against one of the trees, we enjoyed this simple but much-needed pleasure. As we ate, our gaze constantly wandered over the village landscape, as if trying to imprint every detail in memory. The ruined buildings and overgrown streets under the evening sun took on a particularly mystical appearance, creating a contrast between the beauty of nature and the tragedy of oblivion that had engulfed this place. After eating and resting, we decided to visit the statue that was supposed to be nearby. After walking about half a mile south of the village, we stumbled upon an astonishing sight. Before us stretched a winding path, trodden by numerous feet. It seemed that this place had become frequented, piquing our curiosity. Deciding to explore where this path led, we soon discovered its endpoint, the very statue, surrounded by a crowd of tourists. About 30 people were cheerfully taking photos near it, adding the snapshots to their social media. This place had evidently become a new tourist attraction, perhaps due to someone's post on social media. The crowd was engrossed in the process of taking photographs, taking selfies, and discussing the best angles for shots. We realized that information about the statue had spread very quickly, but it seemed these people were not yet aware of the village, indicating that interest in this attraction had emerged quite recently. As my friends and I approached the statue, we were struck by its extraordinary realism. The statue was crafted with such masterful precision that it seemed as if we were facing not cold stone, but a living creature, suddenly frozen in time. Especially impressive was the statue's face. Its expression was so eerie that it seemed as if it would come to life and look at us any moment. Coming into close proximity, I couldn't tear my gaze away from its eyes, which were carved with such detail that their emptiness seemed bottomless. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my body, causing goosebumps to form on my skin. It wasn't just a sensation of coldness. It was something deeper, something that seemed familiar yet infinitely distant. I felt my attention focus solely on the statue, and everything around began to lose its contours. The sounds of laughter and conversations of tourists around us turned into distant whispers that slowly faded away, leaving me alone with this stone gaze. The world around me seemed to vanish, leaving me in the void between reality and something unknown, calling from the depths of the statue. It seemed to me that time slowed its pace, and breathing became heavier. In my imagination, the statue came to life, and I felt its cold breath on my skin. With each passing second, the feeling of unease grew, and I realized that being so close to the statue, I had entered into an invisible dialogue with it, drawing me deeper into its trance-like horror. At that moment, I felt a light touch from Thomas, who, noticing my state, tried to bring me back to reality. This touch acted like an instant awakening from a nightmare, and I jerked, breaking the invisible connection that held me under the statue's sway. Gradually returning to reality, I realized how powerful the influence of this stone creation was on my consciousness. Suddenly, I felt the need to urgently leave this place. The cawing of crows, arising seemingly out of nowhere, shattered the silence, causing everyone around to freeze and look up. The birds, gathering into a whirl above our heads, created a sense of impending threat. What was clear sky a moment ago was now rapidly filling with heavy, ominous clouds, obscuring the sun and plunging everything into a sinister twilight. These changes were happening so quickly that it became truly frightening. The thought that I might be the catalyst for these events flashed through my mind. Although common sense rejected this idea as absurd, my sixth sense screamed that something more was happening here than just a change in the weather. When thunder suddenly roared, it seemed to confirm my fears. My friends and the tourists, who until that moment had been absorbed in taking photos, now looked around with surprise and concern. Some of them, frightened by this sudden turn of events, began to seek shelter, while others, on the contrary, rejoiced in the unexpected adventure, unaware of the potential danger of these changes. The rising wind quickly turned into a storm, and the sky was illuminated by a flash of lightning, striking directly at the statue. The explosion that followed the strike threw us back, and we fell to the ground. A moment later, coming to my senses, I rubbed my eyes, which had barely adapted after the dazzling light, and looked around at my friends, asking if they were all right. There was no answer. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of something unimaginable. Turning to the statue, I understood the reason for their silence. The statue, which seemed impenetrable and eternal, began to crack. Cracks like lightning bolts spread from its head downwards, covering the entire figure with a web of chips and fissures. Then, as if a shell, a thin layer of stone began to peel off and fall away, revealing something horrifying hidden inside. Underneath the layers of stone, a creature was revealed that bore little resemblance to beings from our world. Its skin was dark, with patches where it seemed blood showed through a thin membrane. Its eyes were two burning coals, full of rage and hunger. Its jaws were lined with razor-sharp teeth, seemingly designed for tearing flesh, with two long fangs protruding from the top. It let out a loud sigh, and its inhale echoed through the surroundings. We also heard a loud thumping, the beating of its heart, which sounded like a drumbeat, filling the air with dread. The creature slowly surveyed its surroundings, its gaze sliding among us as if assessing prey. We stood, petrified with horror. Suddenly, with a powerful sweep, it unfurled its massive wings and took off with furious speed, instantly seizing one of the tourists who lay closest. Its sharp fangs sank into the unfortunate's throat, eliciting a desperate scream that tore through the silence. This scream was the most horrifying thing I had ever heard. It turned into a shriek, and then the man began convulsing, before falling still. The monster continued to drink his blood, and soon it was evident how the man's body began to wither. His skin tightened, muscles dwindled until only a skeletal frame covered with skin remained. When all that was left of the man was skin and bones, he turned to dust, scattered by the wind. Mike was the first to snap out of it, grabbing my hand and yelling that we needed to run. This shout seemed to awaken us all from paralyzing fear, and we fled, desperately trying to escape the horrifying creature. Another victim's cry echoed behind me, but I dared not look back, focusing all my fear and energy on escape. Breath tore through my chest, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. My friends, Sarah and Thomas, ran alongside me, their faces twisted with fear and determination. Suddenly, I felt something heavy land on top of me, and sharp pain pierced my ear. Glancing back, I saw a crow that had swooped down on us. Their eyes gleamed red like hot coals filled with malice or madness. We tried to fend them off, waving our arms, but the birds were persistent and aggressive. Each struck crow momentarily retreated but then returned with renewed force. Fleeing from the crows was madness. They wouldn't relent, attacking us from the sky, pecking and scratching, leaving bloody wounds on my arms. I kept running until I saw the river ahead, the same one we had come along. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water. Although the river was not deep, about waist high, it provided us with a chance to escape the birds. I heard splashes nearby and with relief realized my friends had followed suit. We submerged ourselves and swam downstream, striving to get as far away from our pursuers as possible. When we finally emerged on the shore, we found that the crows had fallen behind. We were all wet and battered, but fortunately, no one had serious injuries. Everyone tried to catch their breath and recover from the nightmare we had just endured, when suddenly, Sarah screamed in horror, "Where's Jess?" Panic engulfed us all at that moment. We quickly looked around, but Jess was nowhere to be seen. My heart froze with a sense of foreboding. Jess had been with us when we started running, but now she was nowhere near. Perhaps she had fallen behind or tripped while we ran to the river. Confronted with the reality of our situation, we faced a difficult choice. Standing frightened on the riverbank, we realized that going back into the woods to search for Jess could cost us our lives. Thomas was the first to voice aloud what perhaps all of us subconsciously understood. Thomas's words brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She was overwhelmed with despair and fear for her friend. We tried to comfort her, but deep down, each of us felt the weight of the situation. Mike, trying to find words of reassurance, said that we had no choice but to hope Jess could survive and find her way to safety on her own. It was a tough decision, but the risk to the entire group was too great, and we couldn't afford to act on emotions. In the end, we decided to go downstream along the river, hoping to find a safe place and possibly help. Every step was difficult for us, as the heaviness remained in our hearts for leaving our friend behind. But at the same time, we understood that our responsibility was to preserve our own lives to have a chance to help Jess in the future. Continuing our journey, we looked around at every rustle and sound, fearing that the monster or crows might be following us. Moving along the riverbank, our attention was suddenly drawn by Thomas's piercing scream. Turning around in fright, we saw him clutching his leg, into which a snake had sunk its fangs. Rushing to his aid, we struggled to pry the snake off, whose eyes glowed ominously red. With some effort, we managed to free Thomas from its grip and destroy the threat, crushing the snake with a stone. Examining the wound, we found ourselves unable to determine if the snake had been venomous. As a first aid measure, we applied a simple bandage to the wound and supported Thomas, continuing our journey. However, it soon became evident that his condition was worsening. His body temperature sharply rose, his gaze became unfocused, and he could barely move on his own. When Thomas eventually collapsed, incapacitated, we realized the seriousness of the situation. Understanding that every minute counted, but also recognizing the impossibility of continuing without proper assistance, we decided to make camp. While resting and trying to revive Thomas, an unexpected rustle in the bushes made us tense up. However, to our surprise and relief, Jess emerged from the bushes, our long-lost companion. Seeing her friend, Sarah couldn't contain herself and rushed to her, hugging and apologizing for leaving her behind. Jess, silently shaking her head as if forgiving us, approached and sat next to Thomas. Something about her appearance made me uneasy. Looking into her eyes, I saw red sparks, the same as those of the snake and the creature before. She noticed my fear and smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. Suddenly, a horrifying transformation took place. 2 huge wings sprouted from her back, and she turned into the same monster that had previously terrified us. Before we could react, she sank her teeth into Thomas's neck, sucking the life out of him. We, stunned and frightened, helplessly watched as she did so. Then, overcome with fear, fled without looking back. Glancing back, I cast one last look at the scene of the tragedy and saw only ash, which had once been Thomas, dispersing in the wind. At that moment, I understood how the village residents disappeared and why no bodies were ever found. The creature did not pursue us, as if knowing that we could not escape it. Fleeing through the forest turned into a nightmare that we would never forget. The forest, which had previously seemed like a peaceful refuge, now enveloped us in its dark embrace, becoming a trap from which there seemed to be no escape. Every step on the soft, leaf-covered ground intensified our fear, and the branches of trees, scratching our faces and hands, seemed to try to stop us. The creature that pursued us was the embodiment of our darkest nightmares. Its loud, sharp footsteps and eerie breathing were too close, causing our hearts to beat in time with the rhythm of our frantic flight. Every time it seemed like we had gained a little distance, the wind brought us the sounds of its movements, reminding us that death breathed down our necks. The air in the forest was cold and damp, but our bodies were soaked with sweat from fear and exertion. The moon, shining through the dense canopy of trees, created a dance of shadows on the ground, which confused the mind and made us see the creature in every rustle and movement. Our imagination painted the most horrifying pictures, exacerbating panic and despair. We heard the creature emitting ominous low sounds, resembling loud growls accompanied by hissing that penetrated our souls. These sounds filled the night forest, as if heralding doom, and each of them told us that the creature enjoyed the hunt, that we were mere mice in its trap. At one point, as we crossed a small moonlit clearing, I thought I saw its eyes, two burning red coals in the darkness, watching our every move. This gaze, filled with bloodlust and vengeance, made me realize that hiding from this creature was impossible. Desperation gripped us with every step, but a spark of hope ignited within me as I realized we were nearing the village. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through my mind as I tried to recall any information that could help us survive. Then, a note hanging on the wall in my uncle's house, and the words of the sole survivor from previous monster attacks resurfaced in my memory. They spoke of the chapel. This piece of information seemed to be the key to our salvation. My confidence that the chapel played a crucial role in the creature's history and possibly contained a way to stop it urged me to act swiftly. I exerted all efforts to hasten our pace, and we began to run towards the village with renewed vigor. My friends, noticing the change in my demeanor, also picked up the pace, despite their exhaustion and fear. We tore through the forest like a whirlwind, driven not only by the desire to survive but also by a small glimmer of hope that we would find salvation. As we burst into the village, my heart pounded with fear and hope. The chapel, our last hope, stood right at its center. A menacing roar sounded behind us, a sign that the creature had realized our intentions. I shouted to my friends to hurry, feeling every second was of the essence. Finally, the chapel appeared before us, like a beacon in the darkness. Mike reached the door first, flinging it open and darting inside, followed by Sarah. I, however, ran last, feeling the creature's breath on my neck. In the last moment, realizing I was falling behind, I made a desperate leap forward, feeling the creature grab my leg, which hadn't yet crossed the chapel's threshold. In terror, I screamed as Sarah and Mike firmly grabbed my hands, trying to pull me inside. The struggle was unequal. The creature gripped my leg tightly, and I felt it beginning to drag me back. At that moment, I realized I might not survive. But then I remembered the folding knife in my pocket. With desperation, overcoming the pain, I pulled it out, shouting to my friends to let me go, knowing that my life was the price I was willing to pay for our safety. When they finally let go, I used the moment of surprise to lunge directly at the creature and forcefully stabbed the knife into its eye. With a cry of pain, the creature released me. This was my chance. I recoiled back into the chapel, and the creature, in a rage trying to pursue me, collided with an invisible barrier. It snarled, thrashed, and attempted to break through the protection. but all efforts were in vain. Finally, realizing its powerlessness, the creature relented, and spreading its wings, flew off into the darkness of the night. As night fell, darkness enveloped the chapel, pierced only by distant cries emanating from the depths of the forest. These sounds, sometimes piercing, sometimes mournful, kept us restless, reminding us that danger still lurked nearby. Our phones had no signal, cutting us off from the rest of the world, and we waited for dawn, taking shelter within the walls of the old chapel. Recalling my uncle's investigation and his notes on the creature, I concluded that everything had to end at sunrise the next day. This thought gave us hope, though it didn't promise an easy resolution to our problems. Morning came, but sleep eluded us. We anxiously awaited the first rays of sunlight, which were supposed to dispel the darkness and perhaps our fears along with it. When everything finally quieted down and silence reigned around us, we gathered our strength and decided to leave the chapel. Looking around and ensuring that the immediate threat was gone, we chose to return to the car the same way we came. After traversing the forest, now looked upon with completely different emotions, we reached the car about an hour later. After starting it up, we left that place behind, leaving the chapel and the horrors we endured that night behind. On the way home in the car, a heavy atmosphere of mourning prevailed. We remembered our friends, Thomas and others who couldn't escape this nightmare with us. Sarah wept, mourning the loss, and we all shared in her grief. Tears were the only way to express all the pain and hopelessness we felt after what had happened. What we went through will forever remain with us as a reminder that the world is full of unexplored and sometimes dangerous secrets.